Of the pleasures and pains of opium, much has been written.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. There are places where the veil between the known and the unfathomable is perilously thin. And it is in such realms that truths are best left forgotten. Ancient Kashi, now Varanasi, conceals more than history in its name. With dusk settling, the city wraps itself in a twilight shroud. Smoke threads twist through the air, blending with murmured prayers, thickening the atmosphere with an almost tangible sense of mystery. The Ganges River reflects the glimmering lights of ceremonial fires along the Ghats, where the sacred and the profane dance in the curling mists. The pyres, fed by ancient woods, consume the bodies with a reverence that belies the violence of flames. The air is thick with sandalwood and charred offerings, masking the finality of death under sacred rites. In the shallows of the Ganges, silhouetted figures wade with deliberate steps. These men, draped in the sparse cloth of the destitute, are seekers of the dead's forgotten wealth. Their hands, darkened by river silt and ash, sift through the submerged sands, feeling for the cold bite of metal. Gold rings, necklaces, and the occasional coin dropped from the deceased's pockets. Each piece plucked from the holy river's grip is a macabre token of survival, destined to be cleansed, melted down, and sold to adorn the living. Stepping off a narrow boat onto the stone steps, James Montgomery, a British archaeologist, felt as though he had entered a painting, a scene preserved across the ages. Even with his academic accolades, James clung to his skepticism like a knight to his armor, guarding against the intangible. He believed only in what could be touched, measured, seen. Yet Varanasi seemed determined to erode his certainties. His constant companion, a weathered copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, betrayed a fascination with the afterlife, a scholarly interest, he insisted, nothing more. His trained eyes sketched and noted details as he walked through the bustling streets. It was early spring of 1932, and the British Raj held sway over India. Political tensions were palpable, with the struggle for independence intensifying across many regions like a storm gathering on the horizon. He had spent years poring over texts and artifacts in the dusty confines of the British Museum. This opportunity for field work was a rare departure from his usual scholarly pursuits, and he was determined to make the most of it. Fluent in Sanskrit and well-versed in Hindu and Sikh philosophy and religion, he was chosen for an excavation project at the revered Kashi Vishwanath Temple, one of the 12 Jyotirlingas, the holiest Shiva temples. The task was to study and document newly unearthed relics that had recently been discovered beneath the temple grounds. James had heard rumors of an ancient sanctuary that once stood where the Kashi Vishwanath Temple now dominated. Scholars had long debated its origins, speculating that it might have been dedicated to Vishnu and built during a time when the city was a flourishing center of Vaishnavite worship. This prospect excited him not only for its historical significance, but also for the professional acclaim that such a discovery would bring. James adjusted his satchel and stepped toward the temple, his eyes scanning the intricate carvings with a critical eye. Humorous, an ascetic sect known for extreme Hinduism, roamed the temple grounds. Ignoring the incense and chants, he focused on the worn stone steps, tracing the passage of countless feet over centuries. His fingers brushed against the ancient stone, lingering longer than necessary. His distrust, a fortress against the unknown, was built brick by brick from his strictly rational upbringing. His father, a staunch scientist, had always dismissed anything that couldn't be quantified or measured. Yet, the allure of the mystical and the unexplainable had always gnawed at the edges of James's curiosity. Weeks passed as James meticulously cataloged statues, pottery fragments, and other relics brought up by the excavation team. He spent his days under the relentless sun and his evenings in quiet reflection, poring over his notes and comparing them with historical texts. The heat, the dust, and the ceaseless hum of the city created a backdrop of sensory overload, grounding him in the present even as he delved into the past. The distant sounds of political rallies and protests occasionally broke the monotony, reminding him of the larger currents of change sweeping the nation. One afternoon, Pandit Sharma, the temple's priest and scholar, approached James with a bundle wrapped in cloth. Earlier, workers had found it deep within the temple sanctum. And now, silhouetted against the glaring sun, he carried it with a solemn grace. "What have you there, Pandit Sharma?" James asked, dusting his hands off as he stood. The Pandit paused. "This manuscript was among the items uncovered today, Sahib. The workers thought it prudent to bring it directly to me." James raised an eyebrow. "May I?" he asked, reaching out. Pandit Sharma hesitated for a moment before handing it over. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery." It was a weathered leather manuscript. The cover was adorned with unusual mandalas and arcane symbols. Intrigued, James carefully opened the manuscript. His eyes widened slightly. These symbols, they could date back to the time of the Gupta Empire or even earlier. "Is that possible?" "Very likely, Sahib," the Pandit replied, his voice measured. "That part of the temple has not been disturbed in centuries." James traced a finger over the inscriptions. "These inscriptions, they're unlike anything we've found so far. Quite remarkable how much light this could shed on our understanding of the past." Pandit Sharma nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, it sheds light on forgotten chapters. But even a small light can cast long shadows." James paused, considering the Pandit's words, then smiled slightly. "I am not merely here to unearth the past, Pandit Sharma. I aim to awaken it." Pandit Sharma met his gaze, a hint of understanding in his eyes. "Be mindful, Sahib. Awakened pasts can have lives of their own." James's smile grew. "Precisely, Pandit." He then glanced up, a touch of condescension in his voice. "You're done here. Thanks." With a slight nod, Pandit Sharma turned and walked away, leaving James alone with the manuscript. As James deciphered the text, his breath caught. The manuscript chronicled his life with chilling precision, like a mirror reflecting his deepest secrets. Determined to uncover the manuscript's origins, James carefully closed the ancient pages and clutched it to his chest. He approached one of the workers from the excavation team, asking about the manuscript's origins. They confirmed it had been unearthed from a chamber beneath the temple, near an older sanctuary possibly dedicated to Vishnu, the preserver of time and destiny. James couldn't believe his luck. This find suggested a time when Vaishnavism thrived in Varanasi, possibly before Shaivism took prominence. Archaeologists had searched for this temple for decades, and here it was, right under his feet. His professional hubris soared. He would be the one to unveil its mysteries. The excavation sparked heated debates among local authorities and religious figures. Many saw it as exploitative and desecrating sacred sites. Workers labored under brutal conditions, some collapsing from exhaustion, a few already dead. Precious relics were bound for Britain, trophies of conquest rather than cultural treasures. James saw how the British Raj thrived on deepening religious divides to maintain control. That night, he took the manuscript with him, its weight heavy in his bag. Stepping out of the temple, a sensation of being watched washed over him. He glanced around but saw only the sleepy sun and the twinkle of distant torches. As James moved towards the exit, a nearly naked figure covered in ashes stepped into his path. The Agari's unblinking eyes bored into his, like twin voids absorbing all light. Without a word, he briefly extended his hand, touching James's chest before drawing back. "The past is not a place you can escape," he murmured, his voice a low rasp. He then stepped aside, allowing James to continue. Other Agoras stood like statues in the shade, their eyes fixed on him. He could feel their silent stares following him as he made his way home. Under the weak light of a lone bulb, James hunched over the ancient manuscript spread across the makeshift desk in his rented room near the Ghats. Night had fallen over Varanasi, a cloak of silence occasionally pierced by the distant clamor of street vendors closing shop. His eyes traced the faded Sanskrit inscribed on parchment. The air around him felt unnaturally still, as if the darkness outside was staring at him. As he read further, the words exposed his deepest fears of inadequacy and the recent failure of his marriage. It described the sudden illness and death of his childhood friend, an event that had haunted him for years. It recounted the tragic accident that claimed his sister, down to the exact date and circumstances. The text also revealed his deepest aspirations: to return to Britain as a celebrated scholar, juxtaposed with a chilling prediction that he would never leave India. The manuscript spoke of a future where his work would remain unfinished, his dreams unfulfilled. It knew his private regrets, the letters he wrote but never sent, and his secret fears of dying alone in a foreign land. One evening, a passage caught his eye, a prophecy marking a specific date, ominously close. It predicted a fire that would engulf the Manikarnika Ghat, where the bodies of the dead are cremated in ceaseless pyres. It detailed an ominous ritual involving a sacrifice, ashes and flames. The description was hauntingly visceral. A growing sense of paranoia marked the days that followed. James noticed figures draped in white ashes with stark red markings across their foreheads, appearing frequently in his windows and following him around town. They spoke no words but watched him with an intensity that left his skin crawling. One morning, he found a small clay statue of Shiva outside his door, its eyes painted a vivid red that seemed to follow him into his dream. The auguries seemed less like mere devotees and more like heralds of impending doom. They left offerings that were both a blessing and a warning. Fragrant bundles of herbs used in ancient death rituals, cryptic notes penned in an almost forgotten script, hinting at the inevitable turn of the cosmic wheel. As the festival of Mahashivaratri, the great night of Shiva, approached, bringing crowds of pilgrims to the city, James decided it was time to leave India immediately. He hastily packed his belongings and made plans to buy a ticket for the next ship back to Britain. He rushed back to the temple to gather his materials and return the manuscript, hoping to distance himself from the dark predictions. He walked through crowds of devotees, lost in their reverent prayers. Behind him, the procession of silent agoras maintained their vigil. Beyond mere observers, they seemed to usher him toward a destiny he had yet to comprehend. Pushing open the chamber's heavy stone door, the manuscript in his bag felt like a living heart beating in sync with his own. A heart that felt, with dreadful certainty, the true nature of the cycle it was bound to. He sensed the followers just beyond the doorway, their silent presence pressing in on him. The musty smell of the ancient parchment mingled with the faint scent of incense. He gently put down the manuscript, but the intricate symbols and diagrams evoked an overwhelming familiarity. The memory of his mentor, Dr. Robert Astor, came unbidden. Astor's voice, rich with reverence, speaking of the Akashic records, that boundless archive of all that ever was and will be. Dr. Astor had described it as an energetic log of all existence, recorded in a non-physical plane known as the ether. James had always dismissed these notions as esoteric ramblings, but now, in the manuscript's presence, he felt a dawning realization that perhaps his mentor had been right all along. James had always viewed the teachings of the Upanishads as academic, yet the manuscript's unsettling synchronicities brought them to life, defying his scholarly detachment. He had searched for logical explanations, but each attempt only deepened his unease. The weight of inevitability grew, pressing down on him like an unseen force. It was as if the manuscript tapped into something profound and ancient, recording the fate of humanity with chilling precision. It felt as if the manuscript was a conduit to the Akashic records themselves, linking him to an endless archive of existence. Brahman, the ultimate reality, no longer seemed a distant metaphysical idea, but a palpable truth closing in on him. He felt an inexplicable compulsion to venture deeper into the sanctum. The air grew denser, charged with an energy that made the hairs on his neck stand. Intricate mandalas adorned the walls, their interlocking patterns subtly swirling, almost alive, drawing him further in. The sense of an unseen force grew more intense, a nearly tangible presence pressing in from all sides. Then, at the heart of the sanctum, James encountered the Timeless One. The entity had no definitive form, appearing as a floating mandala, a geometric figure of shifting forms and glowing light that seemed to be everywhere all at once. An irresistible pull gripped him, his feet moving of their own accord, drawing him into the heart of the mandala. Stepping into it, James found himself in the vast library of the Akashic Records, where every event, thought, and possibility was catalogued in endless corridors of knowledge. Shelves stretched beyond sight, each filled with tomes of every life that had ever been and ever would be. He walked through the library, his fingers brushing against ancient scrolls. Each revealed a different path he could have taken, yet all led back to the mandala's center. Every choice, every action had led him here. James encountered visions of his life as he drifted through the Akashic Records. Moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and failure. He saw himself as a child, staring wide-eyed at the night sky, dreaming of its mysteries. He saw his younger self, full of ambition and determination, seeking to unravel the secrets of the past. And he saw his present self, standing at the threshold of cosmic enlightenment, poised to transcend the limits of human understanding. The realization struck him with profound clarity. The illusion of Maya unraveled before his eyes. James's lingering self, a fragile residue of his identity, resisted the truth. He saw himself standing at the edge of the void, the vast expanse of the Akashic Records stretching before him. With a final, desperate act of surrender, he let go, allowing himself to fall into the mandala's center. The geometric patterns converged into a blinding point of light. And in that light, the true nature of the universe was revealed to James. The boundaries of his being faded away, replaced by the infinite expanse of the cosmic order. Enlightenment and terror walked hand in hand through his psyche, as he became one with the eternal truths that had tormented him. Stepping out of the shining temple, naked and transformed, Auguras waited outside, eyes filled with reverence. Their chants, a deep hum of Om Namah Shivaya, rose and fell like the tide. They approached, hands gentle but firm, painting his body with ashes in sacred and surreal ritual. The manuscript's revelations had stripped him of his former self, exposing him to the Timeless One. Shadows blinked under the torchlight, twisting into hideous forms. The Agari's chants swelled, their voices merging into an ominous crescendo. The night pulsed with otherworldly energy. The streets, the river, the city itself seemed to writhe with their own life. The Agaris approached, their hands moving with ritualistic precision, smearing his skin with ashes. The chants grew louder, each note a harbinger of the horrors hidden within that ancient manuscript. The smell of burnt offerings clinging to the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the river. With eyes dark and impenetrable, the Agaris lifted him onto a makeshift bier. Their chants rose as they carried him through the narrow streets, the fire casting long shadows on ancient walls. The city watched in silence as if holding its breath. The procession reached the ghats, where pyres crackled with an insatiable hunger. They laid him on the pyre, the wood rough against his skin. The flames licked at his skin like a searing pan. The Aghoras surrounded him, their chants reaching a fevered pitch. He raised his arms and covered his eyes. The words of Krishna to Arjuna rose from the depths of his memory, carried by a voice that felt both his own and not. If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One, he intoned, the words slicing through the night. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The agorists bowed, their chants rising to an otherworldly intensity, a tangible force pressing in from all sides. The inferno flared higher, casting grotesque silhouettes that danced and twisted in macabre patterns. As the pyre ignited, some agorists stepped into the fire, their chants unwavering. One by one, their bodies were consumed in a final, fiery ritual. Others shared his roasted flesh in an act of utmost devotion, the night filled with the scent of burning flesh and sandalwood. The flames consumed him, the chants fading into a distant hum. The ghats of Varanasi glowed with an ethereal light, the river reflecting the divine dance. The night embraced him, the pyre's ashes mingling with the sacred waters, a tight-lipped witness to the eternal cycle. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Willis had met Miss Hollister but once, and that, for a certain purpose, was sufficient. He was smitten. She represented, in every way, his ideal. Although, until he had met her, his ideal had been something radically different. She was not at all Juno-esque, and the maiden of his dreams had been decidedly so. She had auburn hair, which hitherto Willis had detested. Indeed, if the same hirsute wealth had adorned some other woman's head, Willis would have called it red. This shows how completely he was smitten. She changed his point of view entirely. She shattered his old ideal and set herself up in its stead, and she did most of it with a smile. There was something, however, about Miss Hollister's eyes that contributed to the smiling of Willis's heart. They were great, round, lustrous orbs, and deep. So deep were they, and so penetrating, that Willis's affections were away beyond their own depth the moment Miss Hollister's eyes looked into his, and at the same time he had a dim and slightly uncomfortable notion that she could read every thought his mind held within its folds, or rather, that she could see how utterly devoid of thought that mind was upon this ecstatic occasion. For Willis's brain was set all agog by the sensations of the moment. "By Jove," he said to himself afterwards. For Willis, wise man that he could be on occasions, was his own confidant to the others. "By Jove, I believe she can peer into my very soul. And if she can, my hopes are blasted, for she must be able to see that a soul like mine is no more worthy to become the affinity of one like hers than a mountain rill can hope to rival the Amazon." Nevertheless, Willis did hope. Something may turn up, and perhaps I can devise some scheme by means of which my imperfections can be hidden from her. Maybe I can put stained glass over the windows of my soul and keep her from looking through them at my shortcomings. Smoked glasses, perhaps. And why not? If smoked glasses can be used by mortals gazing at the sun, why may they not be used by me when gazing into those scarcely less glorious orbs of hers? Alas for Willis, the fates were against him. A far-off tribe of fates were in league to blast his chances of success forever, and this was how it happened. Willis had occasion one afternoon to come uptown early. At the corner of Broadway and Astor Place, he entered a Madison Avenue car, paid his fare, and sat down in one of the corner seats at the rear end of the car. His mind was, as usual, intent upon the glorious Miss Hollister. Surely no one who had once met her could do otherwise than think of her constantly, he reflected, and the reflections made him a bit jealous. What business had others to think of her? Impertinent, groveling mortals! No man was good enough to do that. No, not even himself. But he could change. He could at least try to be worthy of thinking about her. And he knew of no other man who could. He'd like to catch anyone else doing so little as mentioning her name. Impertinent, groveling mortals, he repeated. And then the car stopped at 17th Street, and who should step on board but Miss Hollister herself? The idea, thought Willis. By Jove, there she is, on a horse car, too. How atrocious! One might as well expect to see Minerva driving in a grocer's wagon as Miss Hollister in a horse car. Miserable, untactful world to compel Minerva to ride in a horse cart, or rather Miss Hollister to ride in a grocer's car. Absurdest of absurdities. Here he raised his hat, for Miss Hollister had bowed sweetly to him as she passed on to the far end of the car, where she stood hanging onto a strap. I wonder why she doesn't sit down, thought Willis. For as he looked about the car, he observed that with the exception of the one he occupied, all the seats were vacant. In fact, the only persons on board were Miss Hollister, the driver, the conductor, and himself. I think I'll go speak to her, he thought, and then he thought again. No, I'd better not. She saw me when she entered, and if she had wished to speak to me, she would have sat down here beside me, or opposite me, perhaps. I shall show myself worthy of her by not thrusting my presence upon her. But I wonder why she stands. She looks tired enough. Here Miss Hollister indulged in a very singular performance. She bowed her head slightly at someone, apparently on the sidewalk, Willis thought, murmured something, the purport of which Willis could not catch, and sat down in the middle of the seat on the other side of the car, looking very much annoyed. In fact, almost unamiable. Willis was more mystified than ever. But his mystification was as nothing compared to his anxiety when on reaching 42nd Street, Miss Hollister rose and, sweeping by him without a sign of recognition, left the car. Cut, by thunder! Ejaculated Willis in consternation. And why, I wonder? Most incomprehensible affair. Can she be a woman of whims, with eyes like those? Never. Impossible. And yet, what else can be the matter? Try as he might, Willis could not solve the problem. It was utterly past solution as far as he was concerned. I'll find out, and I'll find out like a brave man, he said, after racking his brains for an hour or two in a vain endeavor to get at the cause of Miss Hollister's cut. I'll call upon her tonight and ask her. He was true to his first purpose, but not to his second. He called, but did not ask her, for Miss Hollister did not give him the chance to do so. Upon receiving his card, she sent down word that she was out. 2 days later, meeting him face to face upon the street, she gazed coldly at him and cut him once more. 6 months later, her engagement to a Boston man was announced, and in the autumn following, Miss Hollister of New York became Mrs. Barrows of Boston. There were cards, but Willis did not receive one of them. The cut was indeed complete and final. But why? That had now become one of the great problems of Willis's life. What had he done to be so badly treated? A year passed by, and Willis recovered from the dreadful blow to his hopes. But he often puzzled over Miss Hollister's singular behavior towards him. He had placed the matter before several of his friends, and with the exception of one of them, none was more capable of solving his problem than he. This one had heard from his wife, a school friend and intimate acquaintance of Miss Hollister, now Mrs. Barrows, that Willis's ideal had once expressed herself to the effect that she had admired Willis very much until she had discovered that he was not always as courteous as he should be. Courteous? Not as courteous as I should be, retorted Willis. When have I ever been anything else? Why, my dear Bronson, he added, you know my attitude towards womankind, as well as mankind, has always been. If there is a creature in the world whose politeness is his weakness, I am that creature. I am the most courteous man living. When I play poker in my own rooms, I lose money because I've made it a rule never to beat my guests in cards or anything else. That isn't politeness, said Bronson. That's idiocy. It proves my point, retorted Willis. I'm polite to the verge of insanity. Not as courteous as I should be. Great Scott! What did I ever do or say to give her that idea? I don't know, Bronson replied. Better ask her. Maybe you overdid your politeness. Overdone courtesy is often worse than boorishness. You may have been so polite on some occasion that you made Miss Hollister think you considered her an inferior person. You know what the poet insinuated, Sorosis holds no fury like a woman condescended to by a man. I've half a mind to write Mrs. Barrows and ask her what I did, said Willis. That would be lovely, said Bronson. Barrows would be pleased. True, I never thought of that, replied Willis. You are not a thoughtful thinker, said Bronson dryly. If I were you, I'd bide my time, and some day you may get an explanation. Stranger things have happened, and my wife tells me that the Barrowses are about to spend the coming winter in New York. You'll meet them out somewhere, no doubt. No, I shall decline to go where they are. No woman shall cut me a second time, not even Mrs. Barrows, said Willis firmly. Good. Stand by your color, said Bronson with an amused smile. A week or two later, Willis received an invitation from Mr. and Mrs. Bronson to dine with them informally. I have some very clever friends I want you to meet, she wrote, so be sure to come. Willis went. The clever friends were Mr. and Mrs. Barrows, and to the surprise of Willis, he was received most effusively by the quondam Miss Hollister. Why, Mr. Willis, she said, extending her hand to him, how delightful to see you again. Thank you, said Willis in some confusion. I am sure it is a very pleasant surprise for me. I had no idea. Nor I, returned Mrs. Barrows, and really, I should have been a little embarrassed, I think, had I known you were to be here. It's so very absurd that I almost hesitate to speak of it, but I feel I must. I have treated you very badly. Indeed, said Willis with a smile. How, pray? Well, it wasn't my fault, really, returned Mrs. Barrows. But do you remember, a little over a year ago, my riding uptown on a horse car, a Madison Avenue car, with you? Said Willis, with an affectation of reflection. Let me see. Yes, I think I do. We were the only ones on board, I believe, and, here Mrs. Barrows laughed outright. You thought we were the only ones on board, but we weren't. The car was crowded, she said. Then I don't remember it, said Willis. The only time I ever rode on a horse car with you, to my knowledge, was— I know. This was the occasion, interrupted Mrs. Barrows. You sat in a corner at the rear end of the car when I entered, and I was very much put out with you because it remained for a stranger whom I had often seen, and to whom I had, for reasons unknown even to myself, taken a deep aversion, to offer me his seat, and what is more, compel me to take it. "I don't understand," said Willis. "We were alone on the car." "To your eyes we were, although at the time I did not know it. To my eyes, when I boarded it, the car was occupied by enough people to fill all the seats. You returned my bow as I entered, but did not offer me your seat. The stranger did, and while I tried to decline it, I was unable to do so. He was a man of about my own age, and he had a most remarkable pair of eyes. There was no resisting them. His offer was a command, and as I rode along and thought of your sitting motionless at the end of the car, compelling me to stand, and being indirectly responsible for my acceptance of courtesies from a total and disagreeable stranger, I became so very indignant with you that I passed you without recognition as soon as I could summon up courage to leave. I could not understand why you, who had seemed to me the soul of politeness, should upon this occasion have failed to do not what I should exact from any man, but what I had reason to expect of you." "But Mrs. Barrows," remonstrated Willis, "why should I give up a seat to a lady when there were 20 other seats unoccupied on the same car?" "There is no reason in the world why you should," replied Mrs. Barrows, "but it was not until last winter that I discovered the trick that had been put upon us." "Ah," said Willis, "trick?" "Yes," said Mrs. Barrows, "it was a trick. The car was empty to your eyes, but crowded to mine with the astral bodies of the members of the Boston Theosophical Society." "What?" roared Willis. "It is just as I have said," replied Mrs. Barrows with a silvery laugh. "They are all great friends of my husband's, and one night last winter he dined with them at our house, and who do you suppose walked in first?" "Madame Blavatsky's ghost?" suggested Willis with a grin. "Not quite," returned Mrs. Barrows, "but the horrible stranger of the horse car. And do you know, he recalled the whole thing to my mind, assuring me that he and the others had projected their astral bodies over to New York for a week, and had a magnificent time unperceived by all save myself, who was unconsciously psychic, and so able to perceive them in their invisible forms." "It was a mean trick on me, Mrs. Barrows," said Willis ruefully, as soon as he had recovered sufficiently from his surprise to speak. "Oh, no," she replied, with a repetition of her charming laugh, which re-aroused in Willis's breast all the regrets of a lost cause. "They didn't intend it especially for you anyhow." "Well," said Willis, "I think they did. They were friends of your husband's, and they wanted to ruin me." "Ruin you? And why should the friends of Mr. Barrows have wished to do that?" asked Mrs. Barrows in astonishment. "Because," began Willis slowly and softly, "because they probably knew that from the moment I met you, But that is a story with a disagreeable climax, Mrs. Barrows, so I shall not tell it. How do you like Boston?" The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories. Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. I took a large room far up Broadway in a huge old building whose upper stories had been wholly unoccupied for years until I came. The place had long been given up to dust and cobwebs, to solitude and silence. I seemed groping among the tombs and invading the privacy of the dead. That first night I climbed up to my quarters. For the first time in my life, a superstitious dread came over me, and as I turned a dark angle of the stairway, and an invisible cobweb swung its lazy woof in my face and clung there, I shuddered as one who had encountered a phantom. I was glad enough when I reached my room and locked out the mold and darkness. A cheery fire was burning in the grate, and I sat down before it with a comforting sense of relief. For 2 hours I sat there thinking of bygone times, recalling old scenes and summoning half-forgotten faces out of the mists of the past. Listening, in fancy, to voices that long ago grew silent for all time, and to once familiar songs that nobody sings now. And as my reverie softened down to a sadder and sadder pathos, the shrieking of the winds that sighed softened to a wail. The angry beating of the rain against the panes diminished to a tranquil patter, and one by one the noises in the street subsided until the hurrying footsteps of the last belated straggler died away in the distance and left no sound behind. The fire had burned low. A sense of loneliness crept over me. I arose and undressed, moving on tiptoe about the room, doing stealthily what I had to do, as if I were environed by sleeping enemies whose slumbers it would be fatal to break. I covered up in bed and lay listening to the rain and wind and the faint creak of distant shutters till they lulled me to sleep. I slept profoundly, but how long I do not know. All at once I found myself awake and filled with a shuddering expectancy. All was still. All but my own heart. I could hear it beat. Presently, the bedclothes began to slip away slowly towards the foot of the bed, as if someone were pulling them. I could not stir, I could not speak. Still, the blanket slipped deliberately away till my breast was uncovered. Then, with great effort, I seized them and drew them over my head. I waited, listened, waited. Once more that steady pull began, and once more I lay torpid a century of dragging seconds till my breast was naked again. At last I roused my energies and snatched the covers back to their place and held them with a strong grip. I waited. By and by I felt a faint tug and took a fresh grip. The tug strengthened to a steady strain. It grew stronger and stronger. My hold parted, and for the third time the blanket slid away. I groaned. An answering groan came from the foot of the bed. Beaded drops of sweat stood upon my forehead. I was more dead than alive. Presently I heard a heavy footstep in my room. The step of an elephant, it seemed to me. It was not like anything human. But it was moving from me. There was relief in that. I heard it approach the door, pass out without moving bolt or lock, and wander away among the dismal corridors, straining the floors and joists till they creaked again as it passed. And then silence reigned once more. When my excitement had calmed, I said to myself, "This is a dream, simply a hideous dream." And so I lay thinking it over until I convinced myself that it was a dream. And then a comforting laugh relaxed my lips and I was happy again. I got up and struck a light. When I found the locks and bolts were just as I had left them, another soothing laugh welled in my heart and rippled from my lips. I took my pipe and lit it, and was just sitting down before the fire when down went the pipe out of my nerveless fingers. The blood forsook my cheeks, and my placid breathing was cut short with a gasp. In the ashes on the hearth, side by side with my own bare footprint, was another, so vast that in comparison mine was but an infant's. That I had had a visitor. The elephant tread was explained. I put out the light and returned to bed, palsied with fear. I lay a long time, peering into the darkness and listening. Then I heard a grating noise overhead, like the dragging of a heavy body across the floor. Then the throwing down of the body, and the shaking of my windows in response to the concussion. In distant parts of the building I heard the muffled slamming of doors. I heard at intervals stealthy footsteps creeping in and out among the corridors and up and down the stairs. Sometimes these noises approached my door, hesitated, and went away again. I heard the clanking of chains faintly in remote passages and listened while the clanking grew nearer, while it wearily climbed the stairways, marking each move by the loose surplus of chain that fell with an accented rattle upon each succeeding step as the goblin that bore it advanced. I heard muttered sentences, half-uttered screams that seemed smothered violently, and the swish of invisible garments and the rush of invisible wings. Then I became conscious that my chamber was invaded, that I was not alone. I heard sighs and breathing about my bed, and mysterious whisperings. 3 little spheres of phosphorescent light appeared on the ceiling directly over my head, clung and glowed there for a moment, and then dropped. 2 of them upon my face and 1 upon the pillow. They spattered liquidly and felt warm. Intuition told me that they had turned to gouts of blood as they fell, and needed no light to satisfy myself of that. Then I saw pallid faces, dimly luminous, and white uplifted hands floating bodiless in the air, floating a moment and then disappearing. The whispering ceased and the voices and the sounds, and a solemn stillness followed. I waited and listened. I felt that I must have light or die. I was weak with fear. I slowly raised myself toward a sitting posture, and my face came in contact with a clammy hand. All strength went from me apparently, and I fell back like a stricken invalid. Then I heard the rustle of a garment. It seemed to pass to the door and go out. When everything was still once more, I crept out of bed, sick and feeble, and lit the gas with a hand that trembled as if it were aged with 100 years. The light brought out some little cheer to my spirits. I sat down and fell into a dreamy contemplation of that great footprint in the ashes. By and by its outlines began to waver and grow dim. I glanced up, and the broad gas flame was slowly wilting away. In the same moment I heard that elephantine tread again. I noted its approach nearer and nearer along the musty halls, and dimmer the light waned. The tread reached my very door and paused. The light had dwindled to a sickly blue, and all things about me were in a spectral twilight. The door did not open, and yet I felt a faint gust of air fan my cheek, and presently was conscious of a huge cloudy presence before me. I watched it with fascinated eyes. A pale glow stole over the thing. Gradually, its cloudy folds took shape. An arm appeared, then legs, then a body, and at last a great sad face looked out of the vapor. Stripped of its filmy housings, naked, muscular, and comely, the majestic Cardiff giant loomed above me. All my misery vanished, for a child might know that no harm could come with that benignant countenance. My cheerful spirits returned at once, and in sympathy with them the gas turned up brightly again. Never a lone outcast was so glad to welcome company as I was to greet the friendly giant. I said, "Why is it nobody but you? Do you know I have been scared to death for the last 2 or 3 hours? I am most honestly glad to see you. I wish I had a chair. Here, don't try to sit down in that thing." But it was too late. He was in before I could stop him, and down he went. I never saw a chair slivered so in my life. Stop, you'll ruin it." Too late. There was another crash, and another chair was resolved into its original elements. "Confound it! Haven't you any judgment at all? Do you want to ruin all the furniture on the place? Here, you petrified fool." But it was no use. Before I could arrest him, he sat down on the bed, and it was a melancholy ruin. "Now what sort of way is that to do? First you come lumbering about the place, bringing a legion of vagabond goblins along with you to worry me to death, and then, when I overlook an indelicacy of costume, which would not be tolerated anywhere by cultivated people except in a respectable theater, and not even there if the nudity were of your sex, you repay me by wrecking all the furniture you can find to sit down on. And why will you? You damage yourself as much as you do me. You have broken off the end of your spinal column, and littered up the floor with the chips of your hands till the place looks like a marble yard. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You are big enough to know better." "Well, I will not break any more furniture, but what am I to do? I had not a chance to sit down for a century." And the tears came into his eyes. "Poor devil," I said. "I should not have been so harsh with you. And you were an orphan too, no doubt. But sit down on the floor here. Nothing else can stand your weight, and, besides, we cannot be sociable with you, away up there above me. I want you down where I can perch on this high counting-house stool and gossip with you face to face." So he sat down on the floor and lit a pipe which I gave him, threw one of my red blankets over his shoulders, inverted my sitz bath on his head, helmet fashion, and made himself picturesque and comfortable. Then he crossed his ankles while I renewed the fire and exposed the flat, honeycomb bottoms of his prodigious feet to the grateful warmth. "What is the matter with the bottom of your feet and the back of your legs, that they are gouged up so?" "Infernal chilblains, I caught them clear up to the back of my head, roosting out there under the Newells farm. But I love this place, I love it as one loves his old home. There is no peace for me like the peace I feel when I am there." We talked along for an hour, and then I noticed that he looked tired, and I spoke of it. "Tired?" he said. "Well, I should think so. And now I will tell you all about it since you have treated me so well. I am the spirit of the petrified man that lies across the street, there, in the museum. I am the ghost of the Cardiff giant. I can have no rest, no peace, till they have given that poor body burial again. Now, what was the most natural thing for me to do? To make men satisfy this wish. Terrify them into it, haunt the place where the body lay. So I haunted the museum night after night. I got the other spirits to help me, but it did no good, for nobody ever came to the museum at midnight. Then it occurred to me to come over the way and haunt this place a little. I felt that if I ever got a hearing, I must succeed, for I had the most efficient company that tradition could furnish. Night after night we have shivered around through these mildewed halls, dragging chains, groaning, whispering, tramping up and down stairs, till, to tell you the truth, I am almost worn out. But when I saw a little light in your room tonight, I roused my energies again and went at it with a deal of the old freshness. But I am tired out, entirely fagged out. Give me, I beseech you, give me some hope." I lit off my perch in a burst of excitement and exclaimed, "This transcends everything that ever did occur. Why, you poor blundering old fossil, you have had all your trouble for nothing. You have been haunting a plaster cast of yourself. The real Cardiff giant is in Albany. Confound it, don't you know your own remains?" I never saw such an eloquent look of shame, of pitiable humiliation, overspread a countenance before. The petrified man rose slowly to his feet and said, "Honestly, is that true?" "As true as I am sitting here." He took the pipe from his mouth and laid it on the mantel, then stood irresolute a moment, unconsciously, from old habit, thrusting his hands where his pantaloon pocket should have been, and meditatively dropping his chin on his breast, and finally said, "Well, I never felt so absurd before. The petrified man has sold everything else, and now the mean fraud has ended by selling his own ghost. My son, if there was any charity left in your heart for a poor, friendless phantom like me, don't let this get out. Think how you would feel if you had made such an ass of yourself." I heard his stately tramp die away, step by step down the stairs, and out into the deserted street, and felt sorry that he had gone, poor fellow, and sorrier still that he had carried off my red blanket and my bathtub. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories.
I have always noticed a prevalent want of courage, even among persons of superior intelligence and culture, as to imparting their own psychological experiences when those have been of a strange sort. Almost all men are afraid that what they could relate in such wise would find no parallel or response in a listener's internal life, and might be suspected or laughed at. A truthful traveler, who should have seen some extraordinary creature in the likeness of a sea serpent, would have no fear of mentioning it, but the same traveler, having had some singular presentiment, impulse, vagary of thought, visions so-called, dream, or other remarkable mental impression, would hesitate considerably before he would own to it. To this reticence I attribute much of the obscurity in which such subjects are involved. We do not habitually communicate our experiences of these subjective things as we do our experiences of objective creation. The consequence is that the general stock of experience in this regard appears exceptional, and really is so, in respect of being miserably imperfect. In what I am going to relate, I have no intention of setting up, opposing, or supporting any theory whatever. I know the history of the bookseller of Berlin. I have studied the case of the wife of a late astronomer royal, as related by Sir David Brewster, and I have followed the minutest details of a much more remarkable case of spectral illusion occurring within my private circle of friends. It may be necessary to state, as to this last, that the sufferer, a lady, was in no degree, however distant, related to me. A mistaken assumption on that head might suggest an explanation of a part of my own case, but only a part, which would be wholly without foundation. I cannot be referred to my inheritance of any developed peculiarity, nor had I ever before any at all similar experience, nor have I ever had any at all similar experience since. It does not signify how many years ago, or how few, a certain murder was committed in England, which attracted great attention. We hear more than enough of murderers as they rise in succession to their atrocious eminence, and I would bury the memory of this particular brute, if I could, as his body was buried in Newgate Jail. I purposely abstain from giving any direct clue to the criminal's individuality. When the murder was first discovered, no suspicion fell, or I ought to say, for I cannot be too precise in my facts, it was nowhere publicly hinted that any suspicion fell on the man who was afterwards brought to trial. As no reference was at that time made to him in the newspapers, it is obviously impossible that any description of him can at that time have been given in the newspapers. It is essential that this fact be remembered. Unfolding at breakfast my morning paper containing the account of that first discovery, I found it to be deeply interesting, and I read it with close attention. I read it twice, if not 3 times. The discovery had been made in a bedroom, and when I laid down the paper, I was aware of a flash, rush, flow. I do not know what to call it. No word I can find is satisfactorily descriptive, in which I seemed to see that bedroom passing through my room, like a picture impossibly painted on a running river. Though almost instantaneous in its passing, it was perfectly clear, so clear that I distinctly, and with a sense of relief, observed the absence of the dead body from the bed. It was in no romantic place that I had this curious sensation, but in chambers in Piccadilly, very near the corner of St. James Street. It was entirely new to me. I was in my easy chair at the moment, and the sensation was accompanied with a peculiar shiver which started the chair from its position. But it is to be noted that the chair ran easily on casters. I went to one of the windows. There are 2 in the room, and the room is on the 2nd floor, to refresh my eyes with the moving objects down in Piccadilly. It was a bright autumn morning, and the street was sparkling and cheerful. The wind was high. As I looked out, it brought down from the park a quantity of fallen leaves, which a gust took and whirled into a spiral pillar. As the pillar fell and the leaves dispersed, I saw 2 men on the opposite side of the way, going from west to east. They were one behind the other. The foremost man often looked back over his shoulder. The second man followed him at a distance of some 30 paces, with his right hand menacingly raised. First, the singularity and steadiness of this threatening gesture in so public a thoroughfare attracted my attention, and next, the more remarkable circumstance that nobody heeded it. Both men threaded their way among the other passengers with a smoothness hardly consistent even with the action of walking on a pavement, and no single creature that I could see gave them place, touched them, or looked after them. In passing before my window, they both stared up at me. I saw their two faces very distinctly, and I knew that I could recognize them anywhere. Not that I had consciously noticed anything very remarkable in either face, except that the man who went first had an unusually lowering appearance, and that the face of the man who followed him was of the color of impure wax. I am a bachelor, and my valet and his wife constitute my whole establishment. My occupation is in a certain branch bank, and I wish that my duties as head of a department were as light as they are popularly supposed to be. They kept me in town that autumn when I stood in need of change. I was not ill, but I was not well. My reader is to make the most that can be reasonably made of my feeling jaded, having a depressing sense upon me of a monotonous life, and being slightly dyspeptic. I am assured by my renowned doctor that my real state of health at that time justifies no stronger description, and I quote his own from his written answer to my request for it. As the circumstances of the murder gradually unraveling took stronger and stronger possession of the public mind, I kept them away from mine by knowing as little about them as was possible in the midst of the universal excitement. But I knew that a verdict of willful murder had been found against the suspected murderer, and that he had been committed to Newgate for trial. I also knew that his trial had been postponed over 1 sessions of the Central Criminal Court on the ground of general prejudice and want of time for the preparation of the defense. I may further have known, but I believe I did not, when or about when the sessions to which his trial stood postponed would come on. My sitting room, bedroom, and dressing room are all on one floor. With the last, there is no communication but through the bedroom. True, there is a door in it, once communicating with the staircase, but a part of the fitting of my bath has been, and had been then for some years, fixed across it. At the same period, and as a part of the same arrangement, the door had been nailed up and canvassed over. I was standing in my bedroom late one night, giving some directions to my servant before he went to bed. My face was towards the only available door of communication with the dressing room, and it was closed. My servant's back was towards that door. While I was speaking to him, I saw it open and a man look in, who very earnestly and mysteriously beckoned to me. The man was the man who had gone second from the two along Piccadilly, and whose face was of the color of impure wax. The figure, having beckoned, drew back and closed the door. With no longer pause than was made by my crossing the bedroom, I opened the dressing-room door and looked in. I had a lighted candle already in my hand. I felt no inward expectation of seeing the figure in the dressing-room, and I did not see it there. Conscious that my servant stood amazed, I turned round to him and said, "Derek, could you believe that in my cool senses I fancied I saw a—" As I there laid my hand upon his breast, with a sudden start he trembled violently and said, "Oh Lord, yes, sir, a dead man beckoning." Now, I do not believe that this John Derek, my trusty and attached servant for more than 20 years, had any impression whatever of having seen such a figure until I touched him. The change in him was so startling when I touched him that I fully believe he derived his impression in some occult manner from me at that instant. I bade John Derek bring me some brandy, and I gave him a dram and was glad to take one myself. Of what had preceded the night's phenomenon I told him not a single word. Reflecting on it, I was absolutely certain that I had never seen that face before, except on the one occasion in Piccadilly. comparing its expression when beckoning at the door with its expression when it had stared up at me as I stood at my window, I came to the conclusion that on the first occasion it had sought to fasten itself upon my memory, and on the second occasion it had made sure of being immediately remembered. I was not very comfortable that night, though I felt a certainty, difficult to explain, that the figure would not return. At daylight I fell into a heavy sleep, from which I was awakened by John Derrick's coming to my bedside with a paper in his hand. This paper, it appeared, had been the subject of an altercation at the door between its bearer and my servant. It was a summons to me to serve upon a jury at the forthcoming sessions of the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. I had never before been summoned on such a jury, as John Derrick well knew. He believed, I am not certain at this hour whether with reason or otherwise, that class of jurors were customarily chosen on a lower qualification than mine, and he had at first refused to accept the summons. The man who served it had taken the matter very coolly. He said that my attendance or non-attendance was nothing to him. There the summons was, and I should deal with it at my own peril and not at his. For a day or two I was undecided whether to respond to this call or take no notice of it. I was not conscious of the slightest mysterious bias, influence, or attention one way or another. Of that I am as strictly sure as of every other statement that I make here. Ultimately I decided, as a break in the monotony of my life, that I would go. The appointed morning was a raw morning in the month of November. There was a dense brown fog in Piccadilly, and it became positively black, and in the last degree oppressive, east of Temple Bar. I found the passages and staircases of the courthouse flaringly lighted with gas, and the court itself similarly illuminated. I think that until I was conducted by officers into the old court and saw its crowded state, I did not know that the murderer was to be tried that day. I think that until I was so helped into the old court with considerable difficulty, I did not know into which of the two courts sitting my summons would take me. But this must not be received as a positive assertion, for I am not completely satisfied in my mind on either point. I took my seat in the place appropriated to jurors in waiting, and I looked about the court as well as I could through the cloud of fog and breath that was heavy in it. I noticed the black vapor hanging like a murky curtain outside the great windows, and I noticed the stifled sound of wheels on straw or tan that was littered in the street. Also, the hum of the people gathered there, which a shrill whistle or a louder song or hail than the rest occasionally pierced. Soon afterwards, the judges, 2 in number, entered and took their seats. The buzz in the court was awfully hushed. The direction was given to put the murderer to the bar. He appeared there, and in that same instant I recognized in him the first of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. If my name had been called then, I doubt if I could have answered to it audibly. But it was called about 6th or 8th in the panel, and I was by that time able to say, "Here." Now observe, as I stepped into the box, the prisoner, who had been looking on attentively but with no sign of concern, became violently agitated and beckoned to his attorney. The prisoner's wish to challenge me was so manifest that it occasioned a pause, during which the attorney, with his hand upon the dock, whispered with his client and shook his head. I afterwards had it from that gentleman that the prisoner's first affrighted words to him were, "At all hazards, challenge that man." But, that as he could give no reason for it and admitted that he had not even known my name until he heard it called and I appeared, it was not done. Both on the ground already explained, that I wished to avoid reviving an unwholesome memory of that murderer, and also because a detailed account of his long trial is by no means indispensable to my narrative, I shall confine myself closely to such incidents in the 10 days and nights during which we, the jury, were kept together, as directly bear on my own curious personal experience. It is to that, and not to a page of the Newgate calendar, that I beg attention. I was chosen foreman of the jury. On the second morning of the trial, after evidence had been taken for 2 hours, I heard the church clock strike. Happening to cast my eyes over my brother jurymen, I found an inexplicable difficulty in counting them. I counted them several times, yet always with the same difficulty. In short, I made them one too many. I touched the brother juryman whose place was next me, and I whispered to him, "Oblige me by counting us." He looked surprised by the request, but turned his head and counted. "Why," says he suddenly, "we are but no, that is not possible. No, we are 12. According to my counting that day, we were always right in detail, but in the gross we were always one too many. There was no appearance, no figure to account for it. But I had an inward foreshadowing of the figure that was surely coming. The jury were housed at the London Tavern. We all slept in one large room on separate tables, and we were constantly in the charge and under the eye of the officer sworn to hold us in safe keeping. I see no reason for suppressing the real name of that officer. He was intelligent, highly polite and obliging, and, I was glad to hear, much respected in the city. He had an agreeable presence, good eyes, enviable black whiskers, and a fine sonorous voice. His name was Mr. Harker. When we turned into our 12 beds at night, Mr. Harker's bed was drawn across the door. On the night of the second day, not being disposed to lie down, and seeing Mr. Harker sitting on his bed, I went and sat beside him and offered him a pinch of snuff. As Mr. Harker's hand touched mine in taking it from my box, a peculiar shiver crossed him, and he said, "Who is this?" Following Mr. Harker's eyes and looking along the room, I saw again the figure I expected, the second of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. I arose and advanced a few steps, then stopped and looked round at Mr. Harker. He was quite unconcerned, laughed, and said in a pleasant way, "I thought for a moment we had a 13th juryman without a bed, but I see it is the moonlight." Making no revelation to Mr. Harker, but inviting him to take a walk with me to the end of the room, I watched what the figure did. It stood for a few moments by the bedside of each of my 11 brother jurymen, close to the pillow. It always went to the right-hand side of the bed, and always passed out crossing the foot of the next bed. It seemed, from the action of the head, merely to look down pensively at each recumbent figure. It took no notice of me or of my bed, which was the nearest to Mr. Harker's. It seemed to go out where the moonlight came in, through a high window, as by an aerial flight of stairs. Next morning, at breakfast, it appeared that everybody present had dreamed of the murdered man last night, except myself and Mr. Harker. I now felt as convinced that the second man who had gone down Piccadilly was the murdered man, so to speak, as if it had been borne into my comprehension by his immediate testimony. But even this took place, and in a manner for which I was not at all prepared. On the 5th day of the trial, when the case for the prosecution was drawing to a close, a miniature of the murdered man, missing from his bedroom upon the discovery of the deed, and afterwards found in a hiding place where the murderer had been seen digging, was put in evidence. Having been identified by the witness under examination, it was handed up to the bench and thence handed down to be inspected by the jury. As an officer in a black gown was making his way with it across to me, the figure of the second man, who had gone down Piccadilly, impetuously stared from the crowd, caught the miniature from the officer and gave it to me in his own hands, at the same time saying in a low and hollow tone, before I saw the miniature, which was in a locket, I was younger then, and my face was not then drained of blood. It also came between me and the brother juryman, to whom I would have given the miniature, and between him and the brother juryman, to whom he would have given it. And so it passed on through the whole of our number, and back into my possession. Not one of them, however, detected this. At table, and generally when we were shut up together in Mr. Harker's custody, we had from the first naturally discussed the day's proceedings a good deal. On that 5th day, the case for the prosecution being closed, and we having that side of the question in a completed shape before us, our discussion was more animated and serious. Among our number was a vestryman, the duncest idiot I've ever seen at large, who met the plainest evidence with the most preposterous objections, and who was sided with by 2 flabby parochial parasites, all 3 impaneled from a district so delivered over to fever that they ought to have been upon their own trial for 500 murders. When these mischievous blockheads were at their loudest, which was towards midnight, while some of us were already preparing for bed, I again saw the murdered man. He stood grimly behind them, beckoning to me. On my going towards them and striking into the conversation, he immediately retired. This was the beginning of a separate series of appearances, confined to that long room in which we were confined. Whenever a knot of my brother jurymen laid their heads together, I saw the head of the murdered man among theirs. Whenever their comparison of notes was going against him, he would solemnly and irresistibly beckon to me. It will be borne in mind that down to the production of the miniature on the 5th day of the trial, I had never seen the appearance in court. 3 changes occurred now as we entered on the case for the defense. 2 of them I will mention together first. The figure was now in court continually, and it never there addressed itself to me, but always to the person who was speaking at the time. For instance, the throat of the murdered man had been cut straight across. In the opening speech for the defense, it was suggested that the deceased might have cut his own throat. At that very moment, the figure, with its throat in the dreadful condition referred to, this it had concealed before, stood at the speaker's elbow, motioning across its windpipe, now with the right hand, now with the left, vigorously suggesting to the speaker himself the impossibility of such a wound having been self-inflicted by either hand. For another instance, a witnessed character, a woman, deposed to the prisoner's being the most amiable of mankind. The figure at that instant stood on the floor before her, looking her full in the face and pointing out the prisoner's evil countenance with an extended arm and an outstretched finger. The 3rd change now to be added impressed me strongly as the most marked and striking of all. I do not theorize upon it. I accurately state it and there leave it. Although the appearance was not itself perceived by those whom it addressed, its coming close to such persons was invariably attended by some trepidation or disturbance on their part. It seemed to me as if it were prevented by laws to which I was not amenable from fully revealing itself to others, and yet as if it could invisibly, dumbly, and darkly overshadow their minds. When the leading counsel for the defense suggested that hypothesis of suicide, and the figure stood at the learned gentleman's elbow frightfully sawing at its severed throat. It is undeniable that the counsel faltered in his speech, lost for a few seconds the thread of his ingenious discourse, wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, and turned extremely pale. When the witness to the character was confronted by the appearance, her eyes most certainly did follow the direction of its pointed finger, and rest with great hesitation and trouble upon the prisoner's face. 2 additional illustrations will suffice. On the 8th day of the trial, after the pause which was every day made early in the afternoon for a few minutes' rest and refreshment, I came back into court with the rest of the jury some little time before the return of the judges. Standing up in the box and looking about me, I thought the figure was not there until, chancing to raise my eyes to the gallery, I saw it bending forward and leaning over a very decent woman, as if to assure itself whether the judges had resumed their seats or not. Immediately afterwards, the woman screamed, fainted, and was carried out. So with the venerable, sagacious, and patient judge who conducted the trial. When the case was over, and he settled himself and his papers sum up, the murdered man, entering by the judge's door, advanced to his lordship's desk and looked eagerly over his shoulder at the pages of his notes which he was turning. A change came over his lordship's face. His hand stopped. The peculiar shiver that I knew so well passed over him. He faltered, "Excuse me, gentlemen, for a few minutes. I am somewhat oppressed by the vitiated air," and did not recover until he had drunk a glass of water. Through all the monotony of 6 of those interminable 10 days, the same judges and others on the bench, the same murderer in the dock, the same lawyers at the table, the same tones of questions and answers rising to the roof of the court, the same scratching of the judge's pen, the same ushers going in and out, the same lights kindled at the same hour when there had been any natural light of day, the same foggy curtain outside the great windows when it was foggy, the same rain pattering and dripping when it was rainy, the same footmarks of turnkeys and prisoners day after day on the same sawdust, the same keys locking and unlocking the same heavy doors. Through all the wearisome monotony, which made me feel as if I had been foreman of the jury for a vast period of time, and Piccadilly had flourished coevally with Babylon, the murdered man never lost one trace of his distinctness in my eyes, nor was he at any moment less distinct than anybody else. I must not omit, as a matter of fact, that I never once saw the appearance, which I call by the name of the murdered man, look at the murderer. Again and again I wondered, why does he not? But he never did. Nor did he look at me after the production of the miniature until the last closing minutes of the trial arrived. We retired to consider at 7 minutes before 10 at night. The idiomatic vestryman and his 2 parochial parasites gave us so much trouble that we twice returned into court to beg to have certain extracts from the judge's notes reread. 9 of us had not the smallest doubt about those passages. Neither, I believe, had anyone in the court. The dunder-headed triumvirate, having no idea but obstruction, disputed them for that very reason. At length we prevailed, and finally the jury returned into court at 10 minutes past 12. The murdered man at that time stood directly opposite the jury box, on the other side of the court. As I took my place, his eyes rested on me with great attention. He seemed satisfied, and slowly shook a great gray veil, which he carried on his arm for the first time, over his head and whole form. As I gave in our verdict, guilty, the veil collapsed, all was gone, and his place was empty. The murderer Being asked by the judge, according to usage, whether he had anything to say before sentence of death should be passed upon him, indistinctly muttered something which was described in the leading newspapers the following day as a few rambling, incoherent, and half-audible words in which he was understood to complain that he had not had a fair trial because the foreman of the jury was prepossessed against him. The remarkable declaration that he really made was this: "My lord, I knew I was a doomed man when the foreman of my jury came into the box. My lord, I knew he would never let me off, because before I was taken, he somehow got to my bedside in the night, woke me, and put a rope round my neck."
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Beth was eagerly preparing for her first all-night sleepover party. Even though she was in 6th grade, her parents had never let her have a sleepover before this point. Beth was so excited. She sat in front of her mirror, carefully applying makeup to her pale face and curling her messy blonde hair into perfect spirals. She rummaged through her closet, trying to decide what to wear, before finally settling on a dark red dress with maroon ruffles. The dress was very pretty and brought a smile to Beth's face. Beth looked through her vanity, attempting to find a suitable nail polish. She painted her nails slowly, taking extra care to not smudge the polish. Finally, with all 10 nails painted to perfection, Beth leaned back in her chair and waited patiently for the polish to dry. She watched as the colors deepened and solidified, the glitter catching the light and casting dancing shadows across the room. After a few minutes, she tentatively touched one of her nails to see if the polish was dry. Satisfied, she smiled to herself, admiring the way the red and gold glitter complemented her skin tone. With her appearance sorted, Beth headed downstairs to get everything ready. She rummaged through the cabinet, finding an assortment of snacks, and carefully setting them out where they were easily accessible to her guests. Feeling that something was missing, Beth went down to her basement, ignoring the shiver that ran down her spine. The basement was dark and musty, with so many boxes that it was hard to locate what she was looking for. But after about 10 minutes of searching, Beth finally found it. She grabbed an old dusty wooden board, feeling a sense of excitement and apprehension as she did so. The board had been passed down from her great-grandmother and was rumored to be a tool for communicating with the dead. Despite feeling watched and a little scared, Beth set the board in a corner where no one would see it, determined to try it out later. She knew that it would give her friends a true fright, and she couldn't wait to see their reactions. With everything ready, Beth went back up to her room to await the arrival of her guests, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness for the night ahead. As the guests began arriving, Beth could barely contain her excitement. Soon, everyone was enjoying snacks and talking together. Beth was having the time of her life at her birthday party. She had planned everything to perfection, and all her friends were having a great time. Even Sarah, who was usually reserved, was laughing and making jokes with the rest of the group. Beth had a special surprise planned for her friends in the basement. She had spent days preparing for this moment, and she couldn't wait to see the looks on their faces. As they made their way down the stairs, Sarah gasped at the sight of the many boxes that filled the room. Curiosity got the best of her, and she asked, "What's in all of these boxes, Beth?" Beth grinned mischievously and replied, "This used to be a newspaper shop run by a family who sold newspapers. But one day, their daughter disappeared without a trace." Sarah shivered but didn't say anything more. One of Beth's other friends picked up a random newspaper from a box. The headline read, "Ouija boards, is it safe?" Beth couldn't help but smile. Her plan was already working. She was going to scare her friends like never before. But soon, the girls forgot all about the foreboding news article. They began to share stories about whatever came to their minds. The sleepover was in full swing, with the girls enjoying themselves. Suddenly, Beth pulled out an Ouija board, and Sarah felt uneasy, especially after hearing about the girl who had disappeared. Despite her hesitation, the girls decided to give it a try, placing their fingers on the board and following the guide's instructions. The stone moved and landed on yes when they asked if there was anyone with them. Sarah asked for the spirit's name, and the stone spelled out Cindy. The girls looked at each other, perplexed, and asked why Cindy was there. The stone spelled out, "I died here," sending a chill down the girls' spines. Perhaps the story about the newspaper family that had once lived here was true. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and Beth felt a cold hand on her shoulder. The girls sensed that they were being watched, and they quickly hurried back to Beth's room, trying to pretend that nothing had happened. It was just an innocent game, after all. However, at midnight, they heard soft laughter. Footsteps seemed to be approaching the door, and a small child appeared at the door, glowing bright silver. The girls were terrified, watching as the child walked closer. The ghost of Cindy spoke in a chilling, giggling voice and said, "Oh, no, have you had a fright? That's why you don't use my board at night." The doll-like figure flew towards them, screaming madly. The girls were terrified and tried to flee, but it was too late. They were trapped, and the spirit had them in its grasp. The next day, Beth's parents found no sign of the girls, except for the Ouija board on goodbye and a note that read, "It wasn't so innocent after all." Beth's parents looked everywhere, but they couldn't find a trace. They did, however, find a small news article in the basement. The headline read, "Young girl disappears. Body still not found." The mysterious disappearance of the girls who participated in the sleepover remains unsolved to this day. However, the events of that night taught us a valuable lesson that we should never forget. No matter how harmless a game may appear at first glance, it can always have a dark and dangerous side to it. And never, never use an Ouija board at night, as it can potentially invite malevolent spirits into our world. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. The heart of the Five Towns, that undulating patch of England covered with mean streets and dominated by tall smoking chimneys, whence are derived your cups and saucers and plates, some of your coal, and a portion of your iron, is Hanbridge, a borough larger and busier than its four sisters, and even more grimy and commonplace than they. In the heart of Hanbridge is probably the offices of the Five Towns Banking Company, where the last trace of magic and romance is beaten out of human existence, and the meaning of life is expressed in balances, deposits, percentages, and overdrafts, especially overdrafts. In a fine suite of rooms on the first floor of the bank building resides Mr. Lionel Woolley, the manager, with his wife May, and their children. Yet Mr. Woolley was once brought into contact with the things which cannot be defined and assessed. Once he stood face to face with some strange, visible resultant of those secret forces that lie beyond the human ken. And moreover, the adventure affected the whole of his domestic life. The wonder and the pathos of the story lie in the fact that nature, prodigal though she is known to be, should have wasted the rare and beautiful visitation on just Mr. Woolley. Mr. Woolley was bathed in romance of the most singular kind, and the precious fluid ran off him like water off a duck's back. 10 years ago, on a Thursday afternoon in July, Lionel Woolley, as he walked up through the new park at Bursley to his celibate rooms in Park Terrace, was making addition sums out of various items connected with the institution of marriage. Bursley is next door to Hanbridge, and Lionel happened to be the cashier of the Bursley branch of the bank. He had in mind 2 possible wives, each of whom possessed advantages which appealed to him, and he was unable to decide between them by any mathematical process. Suddenly, from a glazed shelter near the empty bandstand, there emerged in front of him one of the delectable creatures who had excited his fancy. May Lawton was 28, an orphan, and a schoolmistress. She too had celibate rooms in Park Terrace, and it was owing to this coincidence that Lionel had made her acquaintance 6 months previously. She was not pretty, but she was tall, straight, well-dressed, well-educated, and not lacking in experience, and she had a little money of her own. "Well, Mr. Woolley," she said easily, stopping for him as she raised her sunshade, "how satisfied you look." "It's the sight of you," he replied without a moment's hesitation. He had a fine, assured way with women. He need not have envied a curate accustomed to sewing meetings. And May Lawton belonged to the type of girl whose demeanor always challenges the masculine in a man. Gazing at her, Lionel was swiftly conscious of several things: the piquancy of her snub nose, the brightness of her smile, at once defiant and wistful, the lingering softness of her gloved hand, and the extraordinary charm of her sunshade, which matched her dress and formed a sort of canopy and frame for that intelligent, tantalizing face. He remembered that of late he and she had grown very intimate, and it came upon him with a shock, as though he had just opened a telegram which said so, that May, and not the other girl, was his destined mate. And he thought of her fortune, tiny but nevertheless useful, and how clever she was, and how inexplicably different from the rest of her sex, and how she would adorn his house and set him off and help him in his career. He heard himself saying negligently to friends, "My wife speaks French like a native. Of course my wife has traveled a great deal. My wife has thoroughly studied the management of children. Now my wife does understand the art of dress. I put my wife's bit of money into so-and-so." In short, Lionel was as near being in love as his character permitted. And while he walked by May's side past the bowling greens at the summit of the hill, she lightly quizzing the raw newness of the park and its appurtenances, he honestly wondered that he could ever have hesitated between May Lawton and the other. Her superiority was too obvious. She was a woman of the world. In a flash he knew that he would propose to her that very afternoon, and when he had suggested a stroll towards Moorthorne, and she had deliciously agreed, he was conscious of a tumultuous, uplifting, and splendid carelessness of spirits. "Imagine me bringing it to a climax today," he reflected, profoundly pleased with himself. "Ah, well, it will be settled once for all." He admired his own decision. He was quite struck by it. "I shall call her May before I leave her," he thought, gazing at her, and discovering how well the name suited her, with its significances of alertness, geniality, and half-mocking coyness. "So, school is closed," he said, and added humorously, "Broken up is the technical term, I believe." "Yes," she answered, "and I had walked out into the park to meditate seriously upon the question of my holiday." She caught his eye in a net of bright glances, and romance was in the air. They had crossed the couple of smoke-soiled fields, and struck into the old Hanbridge Road just below the abandoned toll house with its broad eaves. "And whither do your meditations point?" he demanded playfully. "My meditations point to Switzerland," she said. "I have friends in Lausanne." The reference to foreign climes impressed him. "Would that I could go to Switzerland too," he exclaimed, and privately, "Now for it, I'm about to begin." "Why?" she questioned with elaborate simplicity. At the moment, as they were passing the toll house, the other girl appeared surprisingly from round the corner of the toll house, where the lane from Toft End joins the high road. This second creature was smaller than Miss Lawton, less assertive, less intelligent, perhaps, but much more beautiful. Everyone halted, and everyone blushed. "May," the interrupter at length stammered. "May," responded Miss Lawton lamely. The other girl was named May, too, May Dean, the child of the well-known Majolica manufacturer, who lived with his sons and daughters in a solitary and ancient house at Toft End. Lionel Woolley said nothing until they had all shaken hands. His famous way with women seemed to have deserted him. And then he actually stated that he had forgotten an appointment and must depart. He had gone before the girls could move. When they were alone, the two Mays fronted each other, confused, hostile, almost homicidal. "I hope I didn't spoil a tete-a-tete," said May Dean stiffly and sharply, in a manner quite foreign to her soft and yielding nature. The schoolmistress, abandoning herself to an inexplicable but overwhelming impulse, took breath for a proud lie. "No," she answered, "but if you had come 3 minutes earlier—" She smiled calmly. "Oh," murmured May Dean after a pause. That evening May Dean returned home at 9:30. She had been with her 2 brothers to a lawn tennis party at Hillport, and she told her father, who was reading the Staffordshire Signal in his accustomed solitude, that the boys were staying later for cards, but that she had declined to stay because she felt tired. She kissed the old widower good night and said that she should go to bed at once. But before retiring, she visited the housekeeper in the kitchen in order to discuss certain household matters: Jim's early breakfast, the proper method of washing Herbert's new flannels — Herbert would be very angry if they were shrunk — and the dog biscuits for Carlo. These questions settled, she went to her room, drew the blind, lighted some candles, and sat down near the window. She was 22, and she had about her that strange and charming nun-like mystery which often comes to a woman who lives alone and unguessed at among male relatives. Her room was her bower. No one, save the servants and herself, ever entered it. Mr. Dean and Jim and Bertie might glance carelessly through the open door in passing along the corridor. But had they chanced in idle curiosity to enter, the room would have struck them as unfamiliar, and they might perhaps have exclaimed with momentary interest, "So this is May's room," and some hint that May was more than a daughter and sister, a woman, withdrawn, secret, disturbing, living her own inner life side by side with the household life, might have penetrated their obtuse paternal and fraternal masculinity. Her beautiful face, the nose and mouth were perfect, and at either extremity of the upper lip grew a soft down. Her dark hair, her quiet voice, and her gentle acquiescence, diversified by occasional outbursts of sarcasm, appealed to them and won them. But they accepted her as something of course, as something which went without saying. They adored her, and did not know that they adored her. May took off her hat, stuck the pins into it again, and threw it on the bed, whose white and green counterpane hung down nearly to the floor on either side. Then she lay back in the chair and, pulling away the blind, glanced through the window. The moon, rather dim behind the furnace lights of Red Cow Ironworks, was rising over Moorthorne. May dropped the blind with a wearied gesture, and turned within the room, examining its contents as if she had not seen them before. The wardrobe, the chest of drawers which was also a dressing-table, the washstand, the dwarf bookcase with its store of Edna Lyalls, Elizabeth Gaskells, Thackeray's, Charlotte Young's, Charlotte Bronte's, a Thomas Hardy or so, and some old school books. She looked at the pictures, including a sampler worked by a deceased aunt, at the loud ticking Swiss clock on the mantelpiece, at the higgledy-piggledy photographs there, at the new Axminster carpet, the piece of linoleum in front of the washstand, and the bad joining of the wallpaper to the left of the door. She missed none of the details which she knew so well, with such long, monotonous intimacy, and sighed. Then she got up from the chair, and opening a small drawer in the chest of drawers, put her hand familiarly to the back and drew forth a photograph. She carried the photograph to the light of the candles on the mantelpiece, and gazed at it attentively, puckering her brows. It was a portrait of Lionel Woolley. Heaven knows by what subterfuge or lucky accident she had obtained it, for Lionel certainly had not given it to her. She loved Lionel. She had loved him for 5 years with a love silent, blind, intense, irrational, and too elemental to be concealed. Everyone knew of May's passion. Many women admired her taste. A few were shocked and puzzled by it. All the men of her acquaintance either pitied or despised her for it. Her father said nothing. Her brothers were less cautious, and summed up their opinion of Lionel in the curt, scornful assertion that he showed a tendency to cheat at tennis. But May would never hear ill of him. He was a god to her, and she could not hide her worship. For more than a year, until lately, she had been almost sure of him, and then came a faint, vague rumor concerning Lionel and May Lawton, a rumor which she had refused to take seriously. The encounter of that afternoon and Miss Lawton's triumphant remark had dazed her. For 7 hours she had existed in a kind of semi-conscious delirium, in which she could perceive nothing but the fatal fact, emerging more clearly every moment from the welter of her thoughts, that she had lost Lionel. Lionel had proposed to May Lawton, had been accepted just before she surprised them together, and Lionel, with a man's excusable cowardice, had left his betrothed to announce the engagement. She tore up the photograph, put the fragments in the grate, and set a light to them. Her father's step sounded on the stairs. He hesitated, and knocked sharply at her door. "What's burning, May?" "It's all right, Father," she answered calmly. "I'm only burning some papers in the fire grate." "Well, see you don't burn the house down." He passed on. Then she found a sheet of notepaper and wrote on it in pencil, using a mantelpiece for a desk. "Dear home, good night, goodbye." She cogitated and wrote further. "Forgive me, May." She put the message in an envelope and wrote on the envelope, "Jim," and placed it prominently in front of the clock. But after she had looked at it for a minute, she wrote, "Father," above Jim, and then "Herbert," below. There were noises in the hall. The boys had returned earlier than she expected. As they went along the corridor and caught a glimpse of her light under the door, Jim cried gaily, "Now then, out with that light. A little thing like you ought to be asleep hours since." She listened for the bang of their door, and then, very hurriedly, she removed her pink frock and put on an old black one, which was rather tight in the waist. And she donned her hat, securing it carefully with both pins, extinguished the candles, and crept quietly downstairs, and so by the back door into the garden. Carlo, the retriever, came halfway out of his kennel and greeted her in the moonlight with a yawn. She patted his head and ran stealthily up the garden, through the gate, and up the waste greenland toward the crown of the hill. The top of Toft End is the highest land in the 5 towns, and from it may be clearly seen all the lurid evidences of manufacture which sweep across the borders of the sky on north, east, west, and south. Northeastwards lie the moorlands, and far off Manifold, the metropolis of the moorlands, as it is called. On this night the furnaces of Red Cow Ironworks in the hollow to the east were in full blast. Their fluctuating yellow light illuminated queerly the grass of the fields above Dean's house, and the regular roar of their breathing reached that solitary spot like the distant rumor of some leviathan beast angrily fuming. Further away to the southwest, the Cauldron Bar Ironworks reproduced the same phenomena, and round the whole horizon, near and far, except to the northeast, the lesser fires of labor leapt and flickered and glinted in their mists of smoke, burning ceaselessly, as they burned every night and every day at all seasons of all years. The town of Bursley slept in the deep valley to the west, and vast Hanbridge in the shallower depression to the south, like two sleepers accustomed to rest quietly amid great disturbances. The beacons of their town halls and churches kept watch, and the whole scene was dominated by the placidity of the moon, which had now risen clear of the red cow furnace clouds and was passing upwards through tracts of stars. Into this scene, climbing up from the direction of Manifold, came Lionel Woolley, nearly at midnight, having walked some 18 miles in a vain effort to re-establish his self-satisfaction by a process of reasoning and ingenious excuses. Lionel felt that in the brief episode of the afternoon he had scarcely behaved with dignity. In other words, he was fully and painfully aware that he must have looked a fool, a coward, an ass, a contemptible and pitiful person, in the eyes of at least one girl, if not two. He did not like this. No man would have liked it, and to Lionel the memory of an undignified act was acute torture. Why had he bidden the girls adieu and departed? Why had he, in fact, run away? What precisely would May Lawton think of him? How could he explain his conduct to her and to himself? And had that worshipping, affectionate thing, May Dean, taken note of his confusion, of the confusion of him who was never confused, who was equal to every occasion and every emergency? These were some of the questions which harried him and declined to be settled. He had walked to Manifold and had tea at the Roebuck, and walked back, and still the questions were harrying. And as he came over the hill by the field path and descried the lone house of the Deans in the light of the red cow furnaces and of the moon, the worship of May Dean seemed suddenly very precious to him, and he could not bear to think that any stupidity of his could have impaired it. Then he saw May Dean walking slowly across the field, close to an abandoned pit shaft, whose low protecting circular wall of brick was crumbling to ruin on the side nearest to him. She stopped, appeared to gaze at him intently, turned, and began to approach him. And he too, moved by a mysterious impulse which he did not pause to examine, swerved and quickened his step in order to lessen the distance between them. He did not at first even feel surprised that she should be wandering solitary on the hill at that hour. Presently she stood still, while he continued to move forward. It was as if she drew him, and soon in the pale moonlight and the wavering light of the furnaces he could decipher all the details of her face, and he saw that she was smiling fondly, invitingly, admiringly, lustrously, with the old undiminished worship and affection. And he perceived a dark discoloration on her right cheek, as though she had suffered a blow. But this mark did not long occupy his mind. He thought suddenly of the strong probability that her father would leave a nice little bit of money to each of his 3 children. And he thought of her beauty, and of her timid fragility in the tight black dress, and of her immense and unquestioning love for him, which would survive all accidents and mishaps. He seemed to sink luxuriously into this grand passion of hers, which he deemed quite natural and proper, as into a soft feather bed, to live secure in an atmosphere of exhaustless worship, to keep a fount of balm and admiration forever in the house, a bubbling spring of passionate appreciation which would be continually available for the refreshment of his self-esteem, to be always sure of an obedience blind and willing, a subservience which no tyranny and no harshness and no whim would rouse into revolt, to sit on a throne with so much beauty kneeling at his feet. And the possession of her beauty would be a source of legitimate pride to him. People would often refer to the beautiful Mrs. Woolley. He felt that in sending May Dean to interrupt his highly emotional conversation with May Lawton, Providence had watched over him and done him a good turn. May Lawton had advantages, and striking advantages, but he could not be sure of her. The suspicion that if she married him, she would marry him for her own ends caused him a secret disquiet, and he feared that one day Perhaps one morning at breakfast, she might take it into her intelligent head to mock him, to exercise upon him her gift of irony, and to intimate to him that if he fancied she was his slave, he was Eve. That she sincerely admired him he never for an instant doubted, and moreover, the unfortunate episode of the afternoon might have cooled her ardor to the freezing point. He stood now in front of his worshipper, and the notion crossed his mind that in after years he could say to his friends, "I proposed to my wife at midnight under the moon. Not many men have done that." "Good evening," he ventured to the girl, and he added with bravado, "We've met before today, haven't we?" She made no reply, but her smile was more affectionate, more inviting than ever. "I'm glad of this opportunity, very glad," he proceeded. "I've been wanting to. You must know, my dear girl, how I feel." She gave a gesture, charming in its sweet humility, as if to say, "Who am I that I should dare?" And then he proposed to her, asked her to share his life, and all that sort of thing. And when he had finished, he thought, "It's done now, anyway." Strange to relate, she offered no immediate reply, but she bent a little towards him with shining, happy eyes. He had an impulse to seize her in his arms and kiss her, but prudence suggested that he should defer the right. She turned and began to walk slowly and meditatively towards the pit shaft. He followed almost at her side, but a foot or so behind, waiting for her to speak. And as he waited, expectant, he looked at her profile and reflected how well the name May suited her, with its significances of shyness and dreamy hope, and hidden fire and the modesty of spring. And while he was thus savoring her face, and they were still 10 yards from the pit shaft, she suddenly disappeared from his vision, as it were by a conjuring trick. He had a horrible sensation in his spinal column. He was not the man to mistrust the evidence of his senses, and he knew, therefore, that he had been proposing to a phantom. The next morning, early because of Jim's early breakfast, when Maindine's disappearance became known to the members of the household, Jim had the idea of utilizing Carlo in the search for her. The retriever went straight, without a fault, to the pit shaft, and May was discovered alive and unscathed, save for a contusion of the face and a sprain in the wrist. Her suicidal plunge had been arrested at only a few feet from the top of the shaft by a cross stay of timber upon which she lay prone. There was no reason why the affair should be made public, and it was not. It was suppressed into one of those secrets which embed themselves in the histories of families, and after 2 or 3 generations blossom into romantic legends of appropriate circumstantial detail. Lionel Woolley spent a woeful night at his rooms. He did not know what to do, and on the following day May Lawton encountered him again, and proved by her demeanor that the episode of the previous afternoon had caused no estrangement. Lionel vacillated. The sway of the schoolmistress was almost restored, and it would have been restored fully had he not been preoccupied by a feverish curiosity, the curiosity to know whether or not May Dean was dead. He felt that she must indeed be dead, and he lived through the day expectant of the news of her sudden decease. Towards night his state of mind was such that he was obliged to call at the Deans. May heard him and insisted upon seeing him. More, she insisted on seeing him alone in the breakfast-room, where she reclined, interestingly white, on the sofa. Her father and brothers objected strongly to the interview, but they yielded, afraid that a refusal might induce hysteria and worse things. And when Lionel Woolley came into the room, May, steeped in felicity, related to him the story of her impulsive crime. "I was so happy," she said, "when I knew that Miss Lawton had deceived me." And before he could inquire what she meant, she continued rapidly, "I must have been unconscious, but I felt you were there, and something of me went towards you, And oh, the answer to your question. I heard your question. The real me heard it, but that something could not speak. My question? You asked the question, didn't you? She faltered, sitting up. He hesitated, and then surrendered himself to her immense love and sank into it, and forgot May Lawton. Yes, he said. The answer is yes. Oh, you must have known the answer would be yes. You did know, didn't you? He nodded grandly. She sighed with delicious and overwhelming joy. In the ecstasy of the achievement of her desire, the girl gave little thought to the psychic aspect of the possibly unique wooing. As for Lionel, he refused to dwell on it even in thought, and so that strange, magic, yearning effluence of a soul into a visible projection and shape was ignored, slurred over, and after 10 years of domesticity in the bank premises, is gradually being forgotten. He is a man of business, and she, with her fading beauty, her ardent, continuous worship of the idol, her half-dozen small children, the eldest of whom is only 8, and the white window curtains to change every week because of the smuts. Do you suppose that she has time or inclination to ponder upon the theory of the subliminal consciousness and kindred mysteries? The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories. Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Hello, below there. When he heard a voice thus calling to him, he was standing at the door of his box with a flag in his hand, throwed round its short pole. One would have thought, considering the nature of the ground, that he could not have doubted from what quarter the voice came. But instead of looking up to where I stood on the top of the steep cutting nearly over his head, he turned himself about and looked down the line. There was something remarkable in his manner of doing so, though I could not have said for my life what. But I know it was remarkable enough to attract my notice, even though his figure was foreshortened and shadowed down the deep trench, and mine was high above him, so steeped in the glow of an angry sunset that I had shaded my eyes with my hand before I saw him at all. Hello, below. From looking down the line, he turned himself about again, and raising his eyes, saw my figure high above him. Is there any path by which I can come down and speak to you? He looked up at me without replying, and I looked down at him without pressing him too soon with the repetition of my idle question. Just then there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back as though it had force to draw me down. When such vapor as rose to my height from the rapid train had passed me and was skimming away over the landscape, I looked down again and saw him refurling the flag he had shown while the train went by. I repeated my inquiry. After a pause during which he seemed to regard me with fixed attention, he motioned with his rolled-up flag towards a point on my level some 200 or 300 yards distant. I called him all right and made for that point. There, by dint of looking closely about me, I found a rough zigzag descending path notched out, which I followed. The cutting was extremely deep and unusually precipitate. It was made through a clammy stone that became oozier and wetter as I went down. For these reasons, I found the way long enough to give me time to recall a singular air of reluctance or compulsion with which he had pointed out the path. When I came down low enough upon the zigzag descent to see him again, I saw that he was standing between the rails on the way by which the train had lately passed, in an attitude as if he were waiting for me to appear. He had his left hand at his chin, and that left elbow rested on his right hand, crossed over his breast. His attitude was one of such expectation and watchfulness that I stopped a moment, wondering at it. I resumed my downward way, and stepping out upon the level of the railroad and drawing near to him, saw that he was a dark, sallow man, with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His post was in as solitary and dismal a place as ever I saw. On either side a dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of sky. The perspective one way only a prolongation of this great dungeon, the shorter perspective in the other direction, terminating in a gloomy red light, and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel in whose massive architecture was a barbarous, depressing, and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot, that it had an earthy, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck chills in me as if I had left the natural world. Before he stirred, I was near enough to have touched him. Not even then removing his eyes from mine, he stepped back one step and lifted his hand. This was a lonesome post to occupy, I said, and it had riveted my attention when I looked down from up yonder. A visitor was a rarity, I should suppose, not an unwelcome rarity, I hoped. In me, he merely saw a man who had been shut up within narrow limits all his life, and who, being at last set free, had a newly awakened interest in these great works. To such purpose I spoke to him, but I am far from sure of the terms I used, for besides that I am not happy in opening any conversation, there was something in the man that daunted me. He directed a most curious look towards the red light near the tunnel's mouth and looked all about as if something were missing from it, and then looked at me. That light was part of his charge, was it not? He answered in a low voice, "Don't you know it is?" The monstrous thought came into my mind as I perused the fixed eyes and the saturnine face that this was a spirit, not a man. I have speculated since whether there may have been infection in his mind. In my turn, I stepped back, but in making the action I detected in his eyes some latent fear of me. This put the monstrous thought to flight. "You look at me," I said, forcing a smile, "as if you had a dread of me." "I was doubtful," he returned, "whether I had seen you before." "Where?" He pointed to the red light he had looked at. "There," I said. Intently watchful of me, he replied, but without sound, "Yes." "My good fellow, what should I do there? However, be that as it may, I never was there, you may swear." "I think I may," he rejoined. "Yes, I am sure I may." His manner cleared like my own. He replied to my remarks with readiness and in well-chosen words. Had he much to do there? Yes, that was to say, he had enough responsibility to bear, but exactness and watchfulness was what was required of him, and of actual work, manual labor, he had next to none. To change that signal, to trim those lights, and to turn this iron handle now and then, was all he had to do under that head. Regarding those many long and lonely hours of which I seemed to make so much, he could only say that the routine of his life had shaped itself into that form, and he had grown used to it. He had taught himself a language down here, if only to know it by sight, and to have formed his own crude ideas of its pronunciation could be called learning it. He had also worked at fractions and decimals, and tried little algebra, but he was, and had been as a boy, a poor hand at figures. Was it necessary for him when on duty always to remain in that channel of damp air, and could he never rise into the sunshine between those high stone walls? Why, that depended upon times and circumstances. Under some conditions there would be less upon the line than under others, and the same held good as to certain hours of the day and night. In bright weather he did choose occasions for getting a little above these lower shadows. but being at all times liable to be called by his electric bell and at such times listening for it with redoubled anxiety, the relief was less than I would suppose. He took me into his box where there was a fire, a desk for an official book in which he had to make certain entries, a telegraphic instrument with its dial, face, and needles, and the little bell of which he had spoken. On my trusting that he would excuse the remark that he had been well educated, and, I hoped, might say without offense, perhaps educated above that station, he observed that instances of slight incongruity in such wise would rarely be found wanting among large bodies of men, that he had heard it was so in workhouses and the police force, even in that last desperate resource, the army, and that he knew it was so, more or less, in any great railway staff. He had been, when young, if I could believe it, sitting in that hut he scarcely could, a student of natural philosophy, and had attended lectures. But he had run wild, misused his opportunities, gone down and never risen again. He had no complaint to offer about that. He had made his bed and he lay upon it. It was far too late to make another. All that I have here condensed he said in a quiet manner, with his grave, dark regards divided between me and the fire. He threw in the word sir from time to time, and especially when he referred to his youth, as though to request me to understand that he claimed to be nothing but what I found him. He was several times interrupted by the little bell, and had to read off messages and send replies. Once he had to stand without the door and display a flag as a train passed, and make some verbal communication to the driver. In the discharge of his duties I observed him to be remarkably exact and vigilant, breaking off his discourse at a syllable, and remaining silent until what he had to do was done. In a word, I should have set this man down as one of the safest of men to be employed in that capacity, but for the circumstance that while he was speaking to me he twice broke off with a fallen color, turned his face toward the little bell when it did not ring, opened the door of his hut, which was kept shut to exclude the unhealthy damp, and looked out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. On both of those occasions he came back to the fire with the inexplicable air upon him which I had remarked without being able to define when we were so far asunder. Said I, when I rose to leave him, "You almost make me think that I have met with a contented man." I'm afraid I must acknowledge that I said it to lead him on. "I believe I used to be so," he rejoined in the low voice in which he had first spoken. "But I am troubled, sir, I am troubled." He would have recalled the words if he could. He had said them, however, and I took them up quickly. "With what? What is your trouble?" "It is very difficult to impart, sir. It is very difficult to speak of. If ever you make me another visit, I will try to tell you. But I expressly intend to make you another visit. Say, when shall it be?" "I go off early in the morning, and I shall be on again at 10 tomorrow night, sir." "I will come at 11. He thanked me and went out at the door with me. "I'll show my white light, sir," he said in his peculiar low voice, "till you have found the way up. When you have found it, don't call out, and when you are at the top, don't call out." His manner seemed to make the place strike colder to me, but I said no more than very well. "And when you come down tomorrow night, don't call out. Let me ask you a parting question. What made you cry, 'Hello, below there,' tonight?" "Heaven knows," said I cried something to that effect. "Not to that effect, sir. Those were the very words. I know them well." "I admit those were the very words. I said them, no doubt, because I saw you below." "For no other reason?" "What other reason could I possibly have?" "You had no feeling that they were conveyed to you in any supernatural way?" "No." He wished me good night and held up his light. I walked by the side of the down line of rails with a very disagreeable sensation of a train coming behind me until I found the path. It was easier to mount than to descend, and I got back to my inn without any adventure. Punctual to my appointment, I placed my foot on the first notch of the zigzag next night as the distant clocks were striking 11. He was waiting for me at the bottom with his white light on. I have not called out, I said when we came close together. May I speak now? By all means, sir. Good night, then, and here's my hand. Good night, sir, and here's mine. With that, we walked side by side to his box, entered it, closed the door, and sat down by the fire. I have made up my mind, sir, he began, bending forward as soon as we were seated, and speaking in a tone but a little above a whisper, that you shall not have to ask me twice what troubles me. I took you for someone else yesterday evening. That troubles me. That mistake? No, that's someone else. Who is it? I don't know. Like me? I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face, and the right arm is waved, violently waved this way. I followed his action with my eyes, and it was the action of an arm gesticulating with the utmost passion and vehemence. For God's sake, clear the way. One moonlight, said the man, I was sitting here when I heard a voice cry, Hello, below there. I started up, looked from that door, and saw this someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel waving as I just now showed you. The voice seemed hoarse with shouting, and it cried, Look out, look out, and then again, Hello, below there, look out. I caught up my lamp, turned it on red, and ran towards the figure calling, What's wrong? What has happened? Where? It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel. I advanced so close upon it that I wondered at its keeping the sleeve across its eyes. I ran right up at it and had my hand stretched out to pull the sleeve away when it was gone. Into the tunnel, said I. No, I ran on into the tunnel, 500 yards. I stopped and held my lamp above my head and saw the figures of the measured distance and saw the wet stains stealing down the walls and trickling through the arch. I ran out again faster than I had run in, for I had a mortal abhorrence of the place upon me, and I looked all around the red light with my own red light, and I went up the iron ladder to the gallery atop of it, and I came down again, ran back here. I telegraphed both ways. An alarm has been given. Is anything wrong? The answer came back, both ways, all well. Resisting the slow touch of a frozen finger tracing out my spine, I showed him how that this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight, and how that figure is originating in disease of the delicate nerves that minister the functions of the eye, were known to have often troubled patients, some of whom had become conscious of the nature of their affliction, and had even proved it by experiments upon themselves. As to an imaginary cry, said I, do but listen for a moment to the wind in this unnatural valley while we speak so low, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires. That was all very well, he returned, after we had sat listening for a while, and he ought to know something of the wind and the wires, he who so often passed long winter nights there alone and watching. But he would beg to remark that he had not finished. I asked his pardon, and he slowly added these words, touching my arm. Within 6 hours after the appearance, the memorable accident on this line happened, and within 10 hours the dead and wounded were brought along through the tunnel over the spot where the figure had stood. A disagreeable shudder crept over me, but I did my best against it. It was not to be denied, I rejoined, this was a remarkable coincidence, calculated deeply to impress his mind. But it was unquestionable that remarkable coincidences did continually occur, and they must be taken into account when dealing with such a subject. Though to be sure I must admit, I added, for I thought I saw that he was going to bring the objection to bear upon me, men of common sense did not allow much for coincidences in making the ordinary calculations of life. He again begged to remark that he had not finished. I again begged his pardon for being betrayed into interruptions. This, he said, again laying his hand upon my arm and glancing over his shoulder with yellow eyes, was just a year ago. 6 or 7 months passed, and I recovered from the surprise and shock, when one morning as the day was breaking, I, standing at the door, looked toward the red light and saw the spectre again. He stopped with a fixed look at me. Did it cry out? No, it was silent. Did it wave its arm? No, it leaned against the shaft of the light with both hands before its face like this. Once more I followed his action with my eyes. It was an action of mourning. I have seen such an attitude in stone figures on tombs. Did you go up to it? I came in and sat down, partly to collect my thoughts, partly because it had turned me faint. When I went to the door again, daylight was above, and the ghost was gone. But nothing followed, nothing came of this. He touched me on the arm with his forefinger twice or thrice, giving a ghastly nod each time. That very day, as the train came out of the tunnel, I noticed at a carriage window on my side what looked like a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal the driver stop. He shut off and put his brake on, but the train drifted past here 150 yards or more. I ran after it, and as I went along heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments, and was brought to here, and laid down on this floor between us. Involuntarily I pushed my chair back as I looked from the boards at which he pointed to himself. True, sir, true, precisely as it happened, so I tell it you. I could think of nothing to say to any purpose, and my mouth was very dry. The wind and the wires took up the story with a long, lamenting wail. He resumed, "Now, sir, mark this, and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since, it has been there, now and again, by fits and starts. At the light, at the danger light. What does it seem to do?" He repeated, if possible with increased passion and vehemence, that former gesticulation of "for God's sakes, clear the way." Then he went on, "I have no peace or rest from it. It calls to me for many minutes together, in an agonized manner. 'Below there, look out, look out!' It stands waving to me. It rings my little bell." I caught at that. "Did it ring your bell yesterday evening when I was here?" And he went to the door. "Twice." "Why, see," said I, "how your imagination misleads you. My eyes were on the bell and my ears were open to the bell, and if I am a living man, it did not ring at those times. No, nor at any other time, except when it was rung in the natural course of physical things by the station communicating with you." He shook his head. "I have never made a mistake as to that yet, sir. I have never confused the spectre's ring with the man's. The ghost's ring is a strange vibration in the bell that it derives from nothing else, and I have not asserted that the bell stirs to the eye. I don't wonder that you failed to hear it, but I heard it." "And did the spectre seem to be there when you looked out?" "It was there." "Both times?" He repeated firmly, "Both times." "Will you come to the door with me and look for it now?" He bit his underlip, as though he were somewhat unwilling, but arose. I opened the door and stood on the step while he stood in the doorway. There was the danger light. There was the dismal mouth of the tunnel. There were the high, wet stone walls of the cutting. There were the stars above them. "Do you see it?" I asked him, taking particular note of his face. His eyes were prominent and strained, but not very much more so, perhaps, than my own had been when I had directed them earnestly toward the same spot. "No," he answered, "it is not there." "Agreed," said I. We went in again, shut the door, and resumed our seats. I was thinking how best to improve this advantage, if it might be called one, when he took up the conversation in such matter-of-course way, so assuming that there could be no serious question of fact between us, that I felt myself placed in the weakest of positions. "By this time you will fully understand, sir," he said, "that what troubles me so dreadfully is the question, what does the spectre mean?" I was not sure, I told him, that I did fully understand. "What is its warning against?" he said, ruminating, with his eyes on the fire and only by times turning them on me. "What is the danger? Where is the danger? There is danger overhanging somewhere on this line. Some dreadful calamity will happen. It is not to be doubted this third time after what has gone before. But surely this is a cruel haunting of me. What can I do?" He pulled out his handkerchief and wiped the drops from his heated forehead. "If I telegraphed danger on either side of me or on both, I can give no reason for it," he went on, wiping the palms of his hands. "I should to get into trouble and do no good. They would think I was mad. This is the way it would work. Message, danger, take care. Answer, what danger? Where? Message, don't know, but for God's sake, take care. They would displace me. What else could they do? His pain of mind was most pitiable to see. It was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life. When it first stood under the danger light, he went on, putting his dark hair back from his head and drawing his hands outward across and across his temples in an extremity of feverish distress. Why not tell me where that accident was to happen, if it must happen? Why not tell me how it could be averted, if it could have been averted? When on its second coming it hit its face, why not tell me instead, she's going to die, let them keep her at home? If it came on those two occasions only to show me that its warnings were true, and so to prepare me for the third, why not warn me plainly now? And I, Lord help me, a mere poor signalman on this solitary station, why not go to somebody with credit to be believed and power to act? When I saw him in this state, I saw that for the poor man's sake, as well as for the public safety, what I had to do for the time was to compose his mind. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality or unreality between us, I represented to him that whoever thoroughly discharged his duty must do well, and that at least it was his comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand these confounding appearances. In this effort I succeeded far better than in the attempt to reason him out of his conviction. He became calm. The occupations incidental to his post as the night advanced began to make larger demands on his attention, and I left him at 2 a.m. I had offered to stay through the night, but he would not hear of it. That I more than once looked back at the red light as I ascended the pathway, that I did not like the red light, and that I should have slept but poorly if my bed had been under it, I see no reason to conceal. Nor did I like the two sequences of the accident and the dead girl. I see no reason to conceal that either. But what ran most in my thoughts was the consideration, how ought I to act, having become the recipient of this disclosure? I had proved the man to be intelligent, vigilant, painstaking, and exact, but how long might he remain so in his state of mind? Though in a subordinate position, still he held a most important trust. And would I, for instance, like to stake my own life on the chances of his continuing to execute it with precision? Unable to overcome a feeling that there would be something treacherous in my communicating what he had told me to his superiors in the company, without first being plain with himself and proposing a middle course to him, I ultimately resolved to offer to accompany him, otherwise keeping a secret for the present, to the wisest medical practitioner we could hear of in those parts, and to take his opinion. A change in his time of duty would come round next night, he had apprised me, and he would be off an hour or two after sunrise, and on again soon after sunset. I had appointed to return accordingly. Next evening was a lovely evening, and I walked out early to enjoy it. The sun was not yet quite down when I traversed the field path near the top of the deep cutting. I would extend my walk for an hour, I said to myself, half an hour on and half an hour back, and it would then be time to go to my signalman's box. Before pursuing my stroll, I stepped to the brink and mechanically looked down from the point from which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me when close at the mouth of the tunnel I saw the appearance of a man with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. The nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment, for in a moment I saw that this appearance of a man was a man indeed, and that there was a little group of other men standing at a short distance, to whom he seemed to be rehearsing the gesture he made. The danger light was not yet lighted. Against its shaft, a little low hut, entirely new to me, had been made of some wooden supports and tarpaulin. It looked no bigger than a bed. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, with a flashing self-reproachful fear that fatal mischief had come of my leaving the man there, and causing no one to be sent to overlook or correct what he did, I descended the notched path with all the speed I could make. "What's the matter?" I asked the men. "Signalman killed this morning, sir." "Not the man belonging to that box?" "Yes, sir." "Not the man I know." "You will recognize him, sir, if you knew him," said the man who spoke for the others, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising the end of the tarpaulin, for his face is quite composed. "Well, how did this happen? How did this happen?" I asked, turning from one to another as the hut closed in again. "He was cut down by an engine, sir. No man in England knew of his work better, but somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. It was just at broad day. He had struck the light and had the lamp in his hand. As the engine came out of the tunnel, his back was towards her and she cut him down. That man drove her, and was showing how it happened. Show the gentleman, Tom." The man who wore rough dark dress stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel. "Coming round the curve in the tunnel, sir," he said, "I saw him at the end, like as if I saw him down a perspective glass. There was no time to check speed, and I knew I'd be very careful. As he didn't seem to take heed of the whistle, I shut it off when we were running down upon him and called him as loud as I could call." "What did you say?" "I said, 'Below there, look out, for God's sake, clear the way.'" I started. "Ah, it was a dreadful time, sir. I never left off calling to it. I put this arm before my eyes not to see, and I waved this arm to the last, but it was no use." Without prolonging the narrative to dwell on any one of its curious circumstances more than on any other, I may, in closing it, point out the coincidence that the warning of the engine driver included not only the words which the unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also the words which I myself, not he, had attached, and that only in my own mind, to the gesticulation he had imitated. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories. Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, its hues are as various as the hues of the arch. As distinct, too, yet as intimately blended. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow. How is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness? From the covenant of peace a simile of sorrow? But as, in ethics, evil is a consequence of good, so in fact, out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of past bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies which are have their origin in the ecstasies which might have been. My baptismal name is Aegeus. That of my family I will not mention. Yet there are no towers in the land more time-honored than my gloomy, grey hereditary halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in many striking particulars, in the character of the family mansion, in the frescoes of the chief saloon, in the tapestries of the dormitories, in the chiseling of some buttresses in the armory, but more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the fashion of the library chamber, and lastly, in the very peculiar nature of the library's contents, there is more than sufficient evidence to warrant the belief. The recollections of my earliest years are connected with that chamber, and with its volumes, of which latter I will say no more. Here died my mother. Herein was I born. But it is mere idleness to say that I had not lived before, that the soul has no previous existence. You deny it? Let us not argue the matter. Convinced myself, I seek not to convince. There is, however, a remembrance of aerial forms, of spiritual and meaning eyes, of sounds musical yet sad, a remembrance which will not be excluded, a memory like shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow too, in the impossibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber I was born, thus awakening from the long night of what seemed but was not, non-entity, at once into the very regions of fairyland, into a place of imagination, into the wild dominions of monastic thought and erudition. It is not singular that I gazed around me with a startled and ardent eye, that I loitered away my boyhood in books and dissipated my youth in reverie. But it is singular that as the years rolled away, and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansion of my fathers, it is wonderful what stagnation there fell upon the springs of my life. Wonderful how total an inversion took place in the character of my commonest thought. The realities of the world affected me as visions, and as visions only, while the wild ideas of the land of dreams became in turn, not the material of my everyday existence, but in very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls. Yet differently we grew, I ill of health and buried in gloom, she agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers the ramble on the hillside, mine the studies of the cloister, I living within my own heart and addicted body and soul to the most intense and painful meditation. She, roaming carelessly through life with no thought of the shadows in her path, or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice, I call upon her name, Berenice, and from the grey ruins of memory 1,000 tumultuous recollections are startled at the sound. Ah, vividly is her image before me now, as in the early days of her light-heartedness and joy. Oh, gorgeous yet fantastic beauty! Oh, sylph amid shrubberies of Arnheim! Oh, naiad amongst its fountains! And then all is mystery and terror, and a tale which should not be told. Disease, a fatal disease, fell like the simoom upon her frame, and even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, pervading her mind, her habits, and her character, and in a manner the most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of her person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, and the victim, where was she? I knew her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the numerous train of maladies superinduced by that fatal and primary one which effected a revolution of so horrible a kind in the moral and physical being of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing and obstinate in its nature, a species of epilepsy not unfrequently terminating in trance itself. Trance very nearly resembling positive dissolution, and from which her manner of recovery was, in most instances, startlingly abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by no other appellation, my own disease, then, grew rapidly upon me, and assumed finally a monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momently gaining vigour, and at length obtaining over me the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must so term it, consisted in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear indeed that it is in no manner possible to convey to the mind of the merely general reader an adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest, which in my case, the powers of meditation, not to speak technically, busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe. To muse for long unwearied hours with my attention riveted to some frivolous device on the margin or in the typography of a book. To become absorbed for the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shadow falling aslant upon the tapestry or upon the door. To lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp or the embers of a fire. To dream away whole days over the perfume of a flower. To repeat monotonously some common word until the sound, by dint of frequent repetition, ceased to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion and physical existence, by means of absolute bodily quiescence, long and obstinately persevered in. Such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries induced by a condition of the mental faculties, not indeed altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. Yet let me not be misapprehended. The undue, earnest, and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with that illuminating propensity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in by persons of ardent imagination. It was not even, as might first be supposed, an extreme condition, or exaggeration of such propensity, but primarily and essentially distinct and different. In the one instance, the dreamer or enthusiast, being interested by an object usually not frivolous, imperceptibly loses sight of this object in a wilderness of deductions and suggestions issuing therefrom until, at the conclusion of a daydream often replete with luxury, he finds the incitamentum or first cause of his musings entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, though assuming through the medium of my distempered vision a refracted and unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and those few pertinaciously returning in upon the original object as a centre. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained that supernaturally exaggerated interest which was the prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the powers of mind more particularly exercised were with me, as I have said before, the attentive, and are with the daydreamer, the speculative. My books at this epoch, if they did not actually serve to irritate the disorder, partook, it will be perceived, largely, in their imaginative and inconsequential nature, of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I well remember, among others, the treatise of the noble Italian Curius Secundus Curio, De Amplitudine Beati Regni Dei, St. Austin's great work, The City of God, and Tertullian's De Carne Christi, in which the paradoxical sentence, Mortuus est Dei filius, credibili et quia ineptum est, et sepultus resurrexit, certum est quia impossibili est, occupied my undivided time for many weeks of laborious and fruitless investigation. Thus it will appear that, shaken from its balance only by trivial things, my reason bore resemblance to that ocean crag spoken of by Ptolemy Hephaestion, which, steadily resisting the attacks of human violence and the fiercer fury of the waters and the winds, trembled only to the touch of the flower called asphodel. And although to a careless thinker it might appear a matter beyond doubt, that the alteration produced by her unhappy malady in the moral condition of Berenice would afford me many objects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation whose nature I have been at some trouble in explaining, yet such was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, her calamity indeed gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder frequently and bitterly upon the wonder-working means by which so strange a revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. But these reflections partook not of the idiosyncrasy of my disease, and were such as would have occurred under similar circumstances to the ordinary mass of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder revelled in the less important but more startling changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice, in the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity. During the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty, most surely I had never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions always were of the mind. Through the grey of the early morning, among the trellised shadows of the forest at noonday, and in the silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her. Not as the living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream. Not as a being of the earth, earthly, but as the abstraction of such a being. Not as a thing to admire, but to analyze. Not as an object of love, but as the theme of the most abstruse though desultory speculation. And now I shuddered in her presence, and grew pale at her approach. Yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition, I called to mind that she had loved me long, and in an evil moment I spoke to her of marriage. And at length the period of our nuptials was approaching, when upon an afternoon in the winter of the year, One of those unseasonably warm, calm and misty days which are the nurse of the beautiful halcyon, I sat as I thought alone, in the inner apartment of the library, but uplifting my eyes I saw that Berenice stood before me. Was it my own excited imagination, or the mystery influence of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the grey draperies which fell around her figure that caused in it so vacillating and indistinct an outline? I could not tell. She spoke no word, and I, not for worlds could I have uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame, a sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me. A consuming curiosity pervaded my soul, and sinking back upon the chair I remained for some time breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emaciation was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked in any single line of the contour. My burning glances at last fell upon the face. The forehead was high and very pale and singularly placid, and the once jetty hair fell partially over it, and overshadowed the hollow temples with innumerable ringlets now of a vivid yellow, and jarring discordantly in their fantastic character with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless and lustreless and seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare to the contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of peculiar meaning, the teeth of the challenged Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God I had never beheld them, or that having done so, I had died. The shutting of a door disturbed me, and looking up, I found that my cousin had departed from the chamber. But from the disordered chamber of my brain had it not, alas, departed, and would not be driven away, the white and ghastly spectrum of the teeth. Not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture in their edges, but what that period of her smile had sufficed to blend in upon my memory. I saw them now even more unequivocally than I had beheld them then. The teeth! The teeth! They were here and there and everywhere and visibly and palpably before me, long, narrow, and excessively white, with the pale lips writhing about them, as in the very moment of their first terrible development. Then came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against its strange and irresistible influence. In the multiplied objects of the external world I had no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every attitude. I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelt upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon the alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them in imagination a sensitive and sentient power, and even when unassisted by the lips, a capability of moral expression. Of Mademoiselle Salle it has been well said, que tout c'est pas étaillance des sentiments, and of Berenice I more seriously believed que tout c'est dans étaillance des idées. Des idées! Ah, here was the idiotic thought that destroyed me. Des idées! Ah, therefore it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt that their possession could alone ever restore me to peace in giving me back to reason. And the evening closed in upon me thus, and then the darkness came, and tarried, and went, and the day again dawned, and the mists of a second night were now gathering around. And still I sat motionless in that solitary room, and still I sat buried in meditation, and still the phantasma of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy as, with the most vivid and hideous distinctness, it floated about amid the changing lights and shadows of the chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams as a cry of horror and dismay, and thereunto after a pause succeeded the sound of troubled voices, intermingled with many low moanings of sorrow or of pain. I arose from my seat, and throwing open one of the doors of the library, saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maiden, all in tears, who told me that Berenice was no more. She had been seized with epilepsy in the early morning, and now at the closing in of the night the grave was ready for its tenant, and all the preparations for the burial were completed. I found myself sitting in the library and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension, yet its memory was replete with horror. Horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I strived to decipher them, but in vain, while ever and anon, like the spirit of a departed sound, the shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp, and near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character, and I had seen it frequently before, for it was the property of the family physician. But how came it there, upon my table, and why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were in no manner to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, and to a sentence underscored therein. The words were the singular but simple ones of the poet Ebn Zayat. Decebunt mihi sodalis, si sepulchrum amicae visitarum, curus meas aliquantulum fore levitas. Why then, as I perused them, did the hairs of my head erect themselves on end, and the blood of my body become congealed within my veins? There came a light at the library door, and pale as the tenant of a tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous, husky, and very low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound, and then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to my garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand. It was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek I bounded to the table and grasped the box that lay upon it, but I could not force it open, and in my tremor it slipped from my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces. And rolling from it with a rattling sound there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small, white, and ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. My clay hands are becoming solid porcelain. I have always had potter's hands. The throwing water absorbs the moisturizing oils of the skin, leaves the hands rough. The clay paste dries and cracks the skin, leaving it red. But now my hands are hardening. In the bisque firing, my hands harden like porous greenware. The cremated carbon and sulfur escape, exhuming my soul from the earth and clay, little by little drawing it back to its source. The soul stews out in a boiling whistle, agitating out from between the minerals lodged in the ridges and wrinkles of each digit. The palms petrify. The flesh sinters and binds to itself. In the glaze firing, my hands glow red as the enamel stiffens and makes the fingers rigid and reflective. The silicate vitrifies and turns to glass. Dust becomes crystal, like a baby's flesh crystallizing into the windows of the eyes. I am born again in the womb of the kiln. I am a porcelain village. I have received an order for a series of 6 ornate hand-painted vases. It is enough money for Dandan's first semester. But I don't know if I can complete the order. Though I struggle to find my hands, which have become like ghost appendages, I tell no one. I am frightened the orders will dry up. Dandan has been accepted at Columbia University for the fall and has always wanted to go to the United States. And she will need money. So I struggle to find strength and answers. For her. But I fear the pull of Tai Shen, the Great Spirit, the Creator God pulling back the breath of life infused in this jar of clay. The January mornings are misty, with a cold mist hugging the valley. My hands ache from the cold and wet of the river. Though my touch is going, I still feel hot and cold. The dirt is hard and stiff underfoot and smells like the burned dust of the kiln. I dig clay from the banks of the Jialing River. Back at my home shop in Sikiku, I mix various minerals into the clay: kaolin, silica, and feldspars. I then wedge the day's clay on a long wooden table, folding and pressing to remove all of the air. If I do not get out all of the air, the clay will warp and crack in the kiln. Then I begin the process of forming the clay into the shape of finished goods and ready it for 5 days of firing. For pottery, we use a wheel and throw the clay. For complex shapes, a mold. As I mold today's clay into traditional teacups using delicate molds, Dandan brings me my morning tea. It is a jasmine tea. It is a honey orchid oolong tea. It smells of irises and orchids and the misty meadows of the Shikingong Mountain. It tastes sweet like nutty molasses with notes of a mild bitter metallic roast. Bright, coppery, and clean, with an aftertaste of the esters of bubblegum powder that is distinctive of the jasmine resin when properly brewed. If I am a simple rice bowl, Dandan is a hand-painted dining set. My given name is Jing Yuqi, but Dandan and everyone else call me Jane. Sikiku or Longyan Town in Chongqing, China is an ancient place. It means porcelain village and, if legend is to be believed, is the birthplace of porcelain. The stone streets border ancestral tea houses, pagodas, street food vendors selling doughy mahua, and antique shops with strings of hanging red lanterns on every storefront. The Baolun Temple stands above the town and stares back at the north gate. Dandan is excited for the Lantern Festival next week. It will be her last before her travels and her great adventure. We need to get ready for the Lantern Festival. Dandan says, Bao Bi, I have a big order I have to fill first. I tell her, Poof, forget about your orders, I am making the Tang Yuan. I went to the market before and I have everything. Brown sugar, sesame seed, walnut, and bean paste. And lots of rice. She says, you go in and start without me, Ningyu. I have to go down to the market and see Dr. Louisu about the pain in my hands. I say, it is so beautiful in the market this time of year. I will miss all of the red lanterns. You know what the old legend says the reason is for the red lanterns. Dandan says, wanting to tell me for the 1100th time, no Baal Bi, what is it? I humor her. The Jade Emperor sensed an uprising when his favorite crane was killed by his villagers. He resolved to destroy the old village on the 15th day of the lunar year, the night of the new moon. The Yuan Xiao Jie. But his daughter overheard his plan. The princess was in love with a poor fisherman's boy in the village. Knowing what was going to happen, she warned the villagers to put up red lanterns all over town. Then she fooled her father, telling him that the gods had already burned the village. And so every year, we use the red lantern to symbolize the mercy of a young girl that overthrows the ill-fated curse of a tyrannical lord and to pray for Yuan-Yu, a fortunate new beginning. Dan says, her face bright with a satisfied smile. You will have your own bright new beginning soon enough. Now go finish making the Tang Yuan. Oh, Amma, you have had pain in your hands all your life. Come help me with the rice balls. Dandan pleaded. Later, B.O.B. Later. I say, Dr. Zhu is a stout man whose black hair has a thick luster, like that of a horse, embroidered with a few shiny thistles of white. His eyes are bright and skin-taut, featuring a vibrancy that is unusual for a man of 76. He wears a white hanfu linen shirt with frog buttons and a choker collar. He smells of licorice and lemon and carries himself in a calm, exacting manner. Nushi Yuchi, what is bothering you? He asks. I am losing feeling in my hands. Losing touch, I tell him. Oh, Jane, that must be terrifying for you, he says, taking my right hand and needling it in a form of massage, pulling on the fingers and working his way down each of the bones of the hand and pressing and squeezing my thumb. Your energy is very weak in these hands. When I am working with the clay, I can't feel where my hand ends and the clay begins, and sometimes I look down and my hands are off the wheel. I tell him, your yin or po can be separated from your spirit. You know the story of Bayu. Zhao Hun, the calling back of the soul. But I have no delirium. There are no devils hiding in my closets. I say, maybe no devils, but Dandan is your heart. She is going to New York soon. Your essence is cold as marrow is cold. Your yang is unstable. But like cures, you must steal a heart to replace lost heart, or you will lose all feeling and body and spirit will be parted forever. Dr. Zhu says, Zhao Hundun Po Tianhuang, cure for cold body, bore open chaos and destroy heaven's neglect. He adds with a wry grin that only a very old man can pull off. You want me to take a lover at 67? I say, perplexed. And then joke, Dr. Zhu. Are you flirting with me? Take a lover. Adopt a stray dog. Whatever it takes to bring feeling back in balance. One more thing, Nushi-Yuchi, get yourself some warm clothes. There will be snow for the Yuan Xiao Jie. All week, there have been clouds over the moon. How does an old lady steal a heart? Is one thing for Dan, but for an old lady like me who is losing her sense of touch to touch another human heart, let alone steal it, is a tall order. I puzzle over strategies and tactics. Food comes to mind. Visual allure is not entirely out of the question, as I have kept my figure and practice yoga daily. Dan is the storyteller. I have no aptitude for words. Painting is another idea. But whose heart can I steal? Where do I even look? Will there be someone at the winter festival of the new moon? The mail lady delivers my mail and the check for the 6 faces is there just in time. I will have to go later and deposit this and get a traveler's check for the gift. I place the bisqueware on a cookie and begin the process of applying the initial glaze coloring. These large white gourd vases are painted with 3 layers of blue glaze. On the mouth are the petals of opening flowers, leading to a border by the lip of the vase. Below, at the bottom of the neck, is another border and a skirt to separate the body of the vase, with branching vines and ornate circular flowers in a fractal design, painted circularly around the curves of the vase to create an effect like movement. I add 2 bluebirds and a hummingbird for added flair. Now for the glaze firing, and then in 3 days, the final touches. And I can't forget the final touch of my special gift, the porcelain chest. I go to see my friend Cece, who works at the candy shop across the way. I walk in past the tourists, and we go in the back area of the shop where she is watching The Real Housewives of New Jersey and spending time on WeChat with her American boyfriend. Cece has big mantis-like eyes and a rounded head. Her hair seems flat on top like a small, tight-fitting cap. Her cheeks are warm and curious, but she has a serious chin. Jane, you came such a long way to see me. I am so delighted. Will you be coming out for the Lantern Festival Friday? I wouldn't miss it. I tell her. So what is going on, Janie? She asks. Dr. Zhu says I have to steal a heart. I say, at your age, you'd sooner steal a penny off a dead man's eyes. She says, hey, I say, it isn't that bad, is it? And I blush, and we both break out in laughter. You know the old folk story about the farmer, right? About the luck. Cece says, no, tell it to me. I say, a farmer gets a horse, which soon runs away. A neighbor says, that's bad news. The farmer replies, good news, bad news, who can say? The horse comes back and brings another horse with him. Good news, you might say. The farmer gives the second horse to his son, who rides it, then is thrown and badly breaks his leg. So sorry for your bad news, says the concerned neighbor. Good news, bad news, who can say? Tss, the farmer replies. In a week or so, the emperor's men come and take every able-bodied young man to fight in a war. The farmer's son is spared. Okay, that is a good story, but I don't know what I'm supposed to get from that. I tell her. It could mean a lot of things, but what I think is maybe you are having trouble letting go of Dan. Maybe, like the horse that runs away comes back with another horse, you gain more by letting her go. Maybe you not meant to steal man's heart. Maybe steal back Dan's heart, make sure she come back to you. Cece, you are very smart and wise. Thank you so much. I tell her and head back to check on my gourd vases and my special porcelain chest. Sikiku is fully lit with thousands of red lanterns, and the Baolun temple is a shining spire, like a tower of red flames, lit and inscribed with hundreds of sigils, all in ornate calligraphy, hanging down in ribbons from its many eaves and archways and boat-like slanting porticos. Throngs of people crowd the streets. The moon is full in the sky. The brisk wind blows, pulling at their scarves and caps and whistling through the ornamental ribbons covered with calligraphy. The riddles attached to the sky lanterns, waves of fluffy white snow tumble down in zigzagging waves, making the stone walkway squeak as peals of laughter and chatter echo down the promenade. Everyone is walking down to the river by the Baolun temple, where the launching of the sky lanterns will take place. Amma, if you can answer my riddle, you will shoot the literary tiger and all the pain in your hands will go away. Dan tells me. Dan's sky lantern has a cryptic riddle hanging off of it in ornate Chinese calligraphy. I can follow you for thousands of miles and not miss home. I do not fear cold or fire, and I desire neither food nor drink. But I disappear when the sun sets behind the western mountains. Who am I? I think on this a long time. I think I know the answer, but I save this secret and hold it in escrow for later. Happy you. Bio B. How did your Tang Yuan come out? I ask. Here, try. Dan says, sticking the sugary dough in my mouth. I chew and taste the brown sugar and the crunchy walnut and gluey bean curd. Very good, Niu, your best yet. Tuan, yuan, happy reunion, happy family. We will miss this next year. I tell her, oh, Amma, I will be back to see you. I'm not leaving forever. She says, say the Kai Den Ki Fu, prayer for good fortune, that you will be back next year and in good health. I tell her, and she does. We reach the river. The fireworks begin to go off, signaling the beginning of the Fang Tian Deng. The time for the releasing of the sky lanterns, with prayers and wishes for the heavens. The snow is coming down now in thick blankets, the drifting flakes shimmering with the light of the moon, and the thousands of lanterns everyone is holding along the banks. I think I know the answer to your riddle, Bayo. Goes for thousands of miles, doesn't get hot or cold, doesn't fear, but disappears with the dying sun. It is a shadow, I tell her. Very good, Amma. You will have much good fortune this new year. Dan says, and now it is time for your New Year's gift, I say with a smile. Amma, what gift? You didn't have to get me anything. Dan says, oh, Bayo, I am so proud of you and excited for your journey, but I will miss you very much. Here, this is for you. I pull out a porcelain chest crafted in red clay in the shape of a heart, glazed 3 times with a red bright glaze like that of the lanterns. Dandan looks up and smiles and holds the porcelain vest close to her chest. Oh, Amma, this is so sweet. Open it, new, I tell her. My hands shake in the cold, but I can scarcely place my fingers. All of the feeling is tingly and tentative, like a spirit without a body, wisping along, transparent as air. She opens the hinge of the lid of the chest and looks inside and sees a key with a red ribbon attached to a little gold locket. What is it, Amma? Dan asks. It is a key to the store, so you can come back anytime, even if I am not there. It will always be yours. And a locket to make new memories. Maybe you will meet a friend or a love at school. And be sure to bring them back home to me when you return. Thank you, Amma. I will, of course. You will always be my heart. Dan says, I feel a tingle in my fingers, where the clay is softening in the warmth of the moment. I can feel the heat of the lantern radiate through my palms and up my forearm. We take the lanterns and hoist them into the air. 1,000 prayers lift into the sky and glow. The red lights blow in the breeze like the spirits of the mountain, snaking along with the gush of the river and the rush of the cold January breeze. I hold Dandan in my arms a long time before we go home. I take the porcelain village out of the kiln. It cools and dries along the banks of the Jialing River. It freezes in time like a memory. It is smooth to the touch, glassy and full of hidden meanings like fine china. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Sedibus ut soltem placidis in morte quiscam. Virgil. In relating the circumstances which have led to my confinement within this refuge for the demented, I am aware that my present position will create a natural doubt of the authenticity of my narrative. It is an unfortunate fact that the bulk of humanity is too limited in its mental vision to weigh with patience and intelligence those isolated phenomena, seen and felt only by a psychologically sensitive few, which lie outside its common experience. Men of broader intellect know that there is no sharp distinction betwixt the real and the unreal, that all things appear as they do only by virtue of the delicate individual physical and mental media through which we are made conscious of them. But the prosaic materialism of the majority condemns as madness the flashes of supersight, which penetrate the common veil of obvious empiricism. My name is Jervis Dudley, and from earliest childhood I have been a dreamer and a visionary. Wealthy beyond the necessity of a commercial life and temperamentally unfitted for the formal studies and social recreations of my acquaintances, I have dwelt ever in realms apart from the visible world, spending my youth and adolescence in ancient and little-known books, and in roaming the fields and groves of the region near my ancestral home. I do not think that what I read in these books or saw in these fields and groves was exactly what other boys read and saw there. But of this I must say little, since detailed speech would but confirm those cruel slanders upon my intellect which I sometimes overhear from the whispers of the stealthy attendants around me. It is sufficient for me to relate events without analyzing causes. I have said that I dwelt apart from the visible world, but I have not said that I dwelt alone. This no human creature may do, for lacking the fellowship of the living, he inevitably draws upon the companionship of things that are not, or are no longer, living. Close to my home there lies a singular wooded hollow, in whose twilight deeps I spent most of my time, reading, thinking, and dreaming. Down its moss-covered slopes my first steps of infancy were taken, and around its grotesquely gnarled oak trees my first fancies of boyhood were woven. Well did I come to know the presiding dryads of those trees, and often have I watched their wild dances in the struggling beams of waning moon. But of these things I must not now speak. I will tell only of the lone tomb in the darkest of the hillside thickets, the deserted tomb of the Hydes, an old and exalted family whose last direct descendant had been laid within its black recesses many decades before my birth. The vault to which I refer is an ancient granite, weathered and discolored by the mists and dampness of generations. Excavated back into the hillside, the structure is visible only at the entrance. The door, a ponderous and forbidding slab of stone, hangs upon rusted iron hinges and is fastened ajar, in a queerly sinister way by means of heavy iron chains and padlocks, according to a gruesome fashion of half a century ago. The abode of the race, whose scions are inurned, had once crowned the declivity which holds the tomb, but had long since fallen victim to the flames which sprang up from a disastrous stroke of the midnight storm which destroyed this gloomy mansion. The older inhabitants of the region sometimes speak in hushed and uneasy voices, alluding to what they call divine wrath, in a manner that in later years vaguely increased the always strong fascination which I felt for the forest-darkened sepulchre. One man only had perished in the fire. When the last of the Hydes was buried in this place of shade and stillness, the sad urnful of ashes had come from a distant land, to which the family had repaired when the mansion burned down. No one remains to lay flowers before the granite portal, and few care to brave the depressing shadows which seem to linger strangely about the water-worn stones. I shall never forget the afternoon when first I stumbled upon the half-hidden house of the dead. It was in midsummer, when the alchemy of nature transmutes the sylvan landscape to one vivid and almost homogeneous mass of green, when the senses are well nigh intoxicated with the surging seas of moist verdure and the subtly indefinable odors of the soil and the vegetation. In such surroundings, the mind loses its perspective. Time and space become trivial and unreal, and echoes of a forgotten prehistoric past beat insistently upon the enthralled consciousness. All day, I had been wandering through the mystic groves of the hollow, thinking thoughts I need not discuss and conversing with things I not name. Here's a child of 10. I had seen and heard many wonders unknown to the throng, and was oddly aged in certain respects. When, upon forcing my way between clumps of briars, I suddenly encountered the entrance of